Side by side with their personal fairy assistant, the Scholar bursts out into the war zone with a devastating array of tools to tactically approach any given scenario that the party may encounter. Planning ahead of time and knowing the subtle nuances of a fight will be rewarded in spades on the Scholar, where they don't only react to damage that already came in, but have an extremely extensive array of tools to manage damage before it even happens. But when the damage does come in, the Scholar is geared up with some of the most powerful emergency healing tools in the entire game. Or you can flip it into overdrive and summon SERAPH, who will bathe the field in an incredible amount of protection, combining solid heals with big beefy shields. And we like big beefy shields here. And want to know the best part of the Scholar? That the fairy will always do her healing for you in the background. No, EOS does not live rent-free here. Does that sound good to you? Let's get into the details of the healer that has been called busted, broken, and overpowered since it was introduced in A Realm Reborn. The Scholar. So a necessary disclaimer before we get into the video is that this video is based off of the media tutor information for the Scholar. Take potency values with a grain of salt because these values may be altered when Endwalker officially is released next month. However, wide sweeping changes are incredibly, and I mean incredibly, unlikely now that we're just a month away. Before I get into the contents of this video, this is a very long video, and as such I have provided extensive timestamps and really put in a lot of effort for those you guys. Make use of them. I did ask the community and they want big, beefy, fully informative guides giving them all of the details, and I'm not going to hold back on this one, especially not for the Scholar. Totally make use of timestamps, leave, come back to the video whenever. This isn't really a one-sitting kind of video. Alternatively, the text form of this is on my own website, evix.gg, under the Ultimate Scholar Guide. Links will be in the description as well as the pinned comment. So in this video, I'm going to be going over the following sections. The first one's going to be a mechanics in-depth analysis. First of all, we're going to go into the fairy view and mechanics, talk about things like the overview of it, pros, cons, proper fairy management with macros, SERAPH, and what's really up with that. We're going to be talking about the second mechanic, which is Aetherflow and its builders and spenders, and then thirdly, we're going to end off with the fairy gauge. Second section is going to be all about abilities, where we're going to be talking about the DPS abilities, the fairy specific abilities, then your own personal healing abilities, augmentation abilities, mobility abilities, or truthfully singular ability, then role actions. Third section is going to be core strengths and analysis of the Scholar, looking at the damage and healing kit and what we're seeing top end speed kill Scholars really be doing in Endwalker. A lot of these conclusions are going to be pretty much the exact same for the most part because the Scholar isn't getting all that many changes in Endwalker. The fourth section is going to be openers and rotations, and then we're going to start this off with the discussion of what a raid buff window is, because that is going to be actually very important even if you're a Scholar. We talk about how to keep track of the raid buff window. Then we're going to leap into a single target discussion where we have a few different openers and maintenance phases to talk about. The first one is going to be Aetherflow Conservation opener. The second one's going to be Aetherflow Dumping, and then we're going to end it off with a kind of capstone saying the reality of your opener as a Scholar, particularly for your comfort, is going to be somewhere between total conservation of Aetherflow and dumping it. Then lastly, we're going to be talking about AoE, which is going to be very brief. The fifth section is going to be a general healing approach where we're going to be talking about, in order from highest to least priority, background healing, which is going to be the fairy. Then we're going to be talking about raw damage mitigation, then off global cooldown healing. Then we're going to be talking about something that's a little bit more conditional, which is going to be barriers. And then we're going to be talking about what you want to avoid the most as possible, which is going to be on GCD Healing. I'm going to capstone this section off with a wrap-off. Then the sixth section is going to be main takeaways and thoughts, which is going to be a very flavorful personal take on it, where we're going to be talking about pros, cons, and total takeaway for the Scholar. And if you want spoilers, the Scholar is going to be extremely consistent as a healer going into Endwalker. In fact, it's going to be the most consistent of any healer, and it is going to be very strong when you know what to look out for. Getting right into the first section, we are going to be going over the Scholar's core mechanics in Endwalker, and right now they're going to be three. First one is going to be the fairy itself, then we have Aetherflow, and lastly the fairy gauge. I'm actually isolating the fairy gauge as its own mechanic because it just has its own tricks and subtle nuances to it, and there's a little bit of interplay between these three mechanics, but I'm trying to just address them one at a time in distinct isolation. So the first mechanic that we're going to be talking about is going to be the fairy, and while this might seem a little bit nuanced at times, this is actually going to be something where if you pay careful attention to it, it's going to pay off in excess. So the fairy itself can be thought of as an easy mobile healing turret that by default is stuck following you, but it's able to be placed down at particular key locations. The fairy will be a consistent, never-ending, free, means costing also no MP or global cooldowns, background heal. It is ridiculously dependable no matter what you do. Further from that, it will all automatically change targets and heal across the party, requiring absolutely no effort or input from you whatsoever to do this. This comes through in the form of the ability Embrace, a pet action for the fairy. Kind of a random history aside is that I remember during A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, and even Stormblood, many forum and Reddit posts were demanding for this Embrace effect to be gutted into the ground because it was not fair. You really know that you've played a game too darn long when you can remember this kind of stuff. But now I'd like to quantify the healing contribution from the fairy a bit. I'm going to be taking top rater data analysis for this from top speed kills of E12S Phase 2 that undeniably volleys out an incredible amount of damage at the party. Embrace is going to be the 4th highest healing contributor in a fight on average from this data. However, we can see that even these scholars, there was a huge range between them, as the maximum healing per second value from Embrace was 2k healing per second. Relative to all other heals, this is a very, very significant effect. Actually, even if we pull up the white mage and be a little saucy here, we can see that Embrace is still a very significant contribution. Think about it like death from 1,000 cuts but in reverse. Party healing by 1,000 Embrace casts. Keep in mind, this is all free. Totally free, no global cooldowns, no MP. Moving on, the fairy acts like a focus. It's going to be the middle zone for fairy abilities to be cast. This means that abilities like Whispering Dawn or Fey Blessing that we're going to talk about in a bit here have their 15 or 20 yard radius based around the fairy's location, not around yours. This actually can be something that you can leverage to your advantage because you can position the fairy in the middle of the arena to continue to hit tanks even if you are in position at really far away yourself. Take particular mechanics, this flexibility can buy you a little bit more breathing room. This exact same idea applies in full with Embrace too. Say your fairy is parked in the middle of the arena. She has a 30-yard range with Embrace to cast on anyone. During some mechanic, you may need to go to the far southeast corner of the arena, say Seed of Sacrifice Extreme right now. In particular, like Meteors or Bahamut phase, something like that. But then you have the tank that has been chipped down to say 50% HP is going to the northwest corner. You will never meet the range requirement to continue to heal them in this instance, but Eos in the middle actually can. So all of this as a sum total adds up to a level of background consistency that is unobtainable on any other healer. This does include the Sage. You need to actively dismiss your fairy or put them in a far off corner to somehow make them stop healing. And I do say while Cardia doesn't have an explicit range to it, there is going to be a lot more restrictions on things like applying Physis 1 or other Sage abilities that do have the Sage as the focus. Now let's dive into detail with the fairy pros, and the biggest perk of the fairy is that it is a consistent, never-ending background heal. It does significantly less healing than White Mage or Astrologian's regen undeniably, but the core strength of it is simply its consistency. Such as if you look at how many casts of regen the White Mages are doing at the top end, it's basically not really being cast at all. Whereas if you look at Embrace, very, very, very consistently being used by the fairy because it costs you absolutely no GCDs, unlike regen that costs a GCD. And really, at the end of the day, if you are running around like a Hrothgar on Skooma or just never casting a single healing spell ever, you will still have the fairy consistently spam out healing. This is actually the one major advantage that the Scholar has even over the Sage, which is the new Endwalker job added. The Sage really needs to do anything and everything in its power to keep DPSing, and is severely punished if they say need to move around the field when they don't have charges of Toxicon available to keep DPSing as they want to do. Let alone the fact that the Sage every single time that they want to cast a non-DPS ability like say Eucration Prognosis for a team-wide bury on the GCD, this means that they're giving up Cardia procs and thus healing potency. As a Scholar, you don't need to worry about that ever. You are having the fairy spam out the heals no matter what, whether you're spamming Succor, whether you're spamming Physick, and please don't spam Physick for the love of God. The fairy's just non-stop gonna do that, no matter what you do. Or take into account the Sage needs to concern themselves with the concept of Cardia weaving, which as a Scholar player myself, I'm not going to downplay how much I do love the Cardia system. They get to pick and choose where their healing is funneled, which is a dramatic improvement over Eos or Selene possibly healing irrelevant chip damage. This is true. I have a lot to say about that in the cons section. But at the end of the day, we kind of need to ask ourselves the question, are we always wanting to keep up with that in the background, the Cardia swapping? Sure, during raid progression where we're raiding for say 2 hours a night, for sure, that's possible. But if you're gaming, chain grinding things for 10 hours straight on a Saturday, chances are most players are going to get fatigued and leave it on the tank and say to hell with the rest of the party. On the other hand, we have Eos and Selene autocorrect and change their target without any assistance at all and heal the entire entire party until it's full. Don't ask questions, you don't ask questions, they just do it. So that long explanation just means that the Scholar ultimately gets a metric ton of quality of life and doesn't need to worry about their fairy system. Essentially, you place it, you forget about it. This will make it so that it's incredibly likely that the Scholars embrace spam. Any Scholar of any skill level will get a lot more from their fairy than the average Sage player will get from Cardia. The average Sage player might not be DPSing as much as they could. They might not be Cardia swapping as much as they could. And so it's very likely that any Scholar, no matter if they are the greenest Scholar or an expert Scholar, is probably going to out-heal the Cardia system with Embrace. There's definitely something to be said about cognitive load during gameplay and that rush of information, especially when you're in progression rating and you're getting new mechanics thrown at you, people making mistakes. There's something to be said about that for sure, and the Scholar's Fairy just does not... It doesn't concern itself with that and will be consistent in the background. We talked a lot about the good, but let's be real here. There are some very big drawbacks to this. And now the bad thing is that the Scholar doesn't have control over the Fairy, and that I can attest to it being incredibly annoying to see the Fairy heal off random chip damage off of a DPS that has no risk of dying. Where I'm really looking at the Fairy, asking them why they did that. Why are you the way that you are? Why are you healing this? I mean, we have the tank being wailed on in this side, but you're choosing to heal the DPS at 90% health. What? Why? Another con that I'm going to introduce a lot more later on is that there is some anti-synergy between the Scholar's Fairy and the rest of their kit. In a particular situation, when we use the Dissipation skill, it is just going to remove the Fairy from existence for 30 seconds. Dissipation does offer significant bonuses like 3 more Aetherflow stacks and 20% healing potency increase, but that does impact only on GCD heals like Adlo or Succor. I need to start getting used to saying Succor. I've always said Succor, but apparently my comments are telling me Succor. I hope that they're not leading me astray. Point is, you are going to be able to get some big beefy shields out. We have a lot to say on that later. This is going to be a very big perk, but regardless, it's hard to not say that losing the Fairy sucks. As we're about to go into really good detail later, the Fairy is also intimately tied to particular powerful off-global cooldown abilities, and so Dissipation locks us out of those skills too. Like I said, there's absolutely something to said about the power of this though, that planning around these effects will be rewarded for the Scholar. I don't want to be completely negative and say, oh, I just popped Dissipation, now I'm suddenly surprised that the Fairy's gone. What a shock. It's something that you plan for. It sucks, but it's something you plan for. Using it properly, totally big reward, but when you don't use it right, painful. And this can be very off-putting, especially to newer Scholars that are just like, wow, the Scholar's completely broken. And it's like, no, just using Dissipation without knowing what it does. And don't get me wrong, it's a quality of life issue that, trust me, I wish that I had all those skills still. I like having those skills, but it is something that you can be aware of. The next con is that when we summon SERAPH, which is a major cooldown that we're going to be talking about extensively later, is that we can potentially ghost abilities from our last Fairy, which sucks to say the absolute least. What ghosting means is that when we issue the command like Whispering Dawn or Fey Illumination on our baseline Fairy, whether it be Eos, whether it be Selene, same thing, but then we immediately after pressing Whispering Dawn, for instance, press SERAPH, that our basic Eos or Selene is going to be replaced by SERAPH. The trick is that Whispering Dawn or Fey Illumination that we issued the command to will go off cooldown, but will not go off because now we have replaced that base Fairy with SERAPH, which can be very jarring if you aren't aware of this interaction ahead of time. Kind of like Dissipation, it's definitely a quality of life issue. I'm the first person to say it would be nice if, well, geez, what if we issued that command, why don't you just bump it up to SERAPH and then she pops out the Whispering Dawn? That would be a huge quality of life improvement. The main thing is like, you just over time when you play the Scholar start to become aware of the cons and when things are gonna go the way that they are going to. Like, it's just like, you know, once you've blown your Fairy cooldowns, then you can go into Dissipation without worry. You don't worry about losing those. Just manage your cooldowns in a way where it's just like, okay, I have 30 seconds, these cooldowns are ticking on cooldown, I'll get them back when Dissipation's done, I'll be fine. Meanwhile, you have 3 Aetherflow stacks to play with. Or the alternative is that you don't immediately pop SERAPH when you press a Fairy ability, and that over time just becomes a little bit of muscle memory. It is just really basic quality of life things to be aware of, thankfully, but I cannot deny that it does annoy even me sometimes. Now we get into the second part of the Fairy mechanic, which is how to manage the Fairy and macros. Note that the number of macros that we have to use as a Scholar has gone dramatically down from before back in Shadowbringers. Regardless, you still want 2 macros at all times and to hotkey them comfortably. The first one is to place the Fairy down, and this is mandatory or you get into a horrible situation where the Fairy falls follows you, which is actually really bad. This has a few downsides. The first thing is that the fairy will always prioritize movements over casting Whispering Dawn or Fey Illumination, whatever. You can in fact make this into a meme by having Eos follow your cursor for placements for a deranged amount of time. This is very, very bad. This is really what you hear about when people are complaining about the fairy delay. Was there much fairy delay on getting Whispering Dawn or Fey Illumination out in this footage now that I have here? Sure, it's not as snappy as a double weave on something else, I agree, but people excessively exaggerate how bad it is. Either that or they haven't learned to place the fairy yet, because yeah, when you're like running around and Whispering Dawn's like super delayed because it's prioritizing movement and can't catch up, yeah, you're gonna have that irritating delay, I agree. Not to mention now, when you have it like following you, you're giving up one of those consistency factors by having Eos placed in the middle of the arena, which gives you the consistency, but if it's following you to like the far southwest side of the arena and the group is at like northeast, you're in trouble. So really macro this, hotkey it, and place Eos wisely in the middle. Now I want to mention outlier cases where you might want to move Eos manually to one side of the arena if the group say needs to move northeast corner of the arena and now the middle isn't necessarily a great place for Eos anymore. This situation can arise. Remember that Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination are 15 or 20 yards of radius, so not too big. Now the next thing that you want as a macro is to have the pet follow you again, and you need to get into the habit of placing the pet, recalling, placing, recalling, especially in dungeons where honestly with a little bit of practice it really becomes natural. I can say after years of doing this on Scholar, I don't even flinch at doing this anymore. The rewards are actually very great when you do this. Now it is time to talk about SERAPH, and yes, this is exactly the same fairy as before but with additional functionalities on top of the baseline. Yes, this means that it listens to your place and follow macros. This means that it consistently volleys out heals without any demands or MP cost to you, and yes, it has the exact same Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination abilities. Don't be deceived, these function the exact same way, you simply have a refreshed, fancier, prettier tooltip icon on them really. When we're looking at SERAPH, especially like in Shadowbringers, the only thing that you were capped from casting with SERAPH out was Fey Blessing. But the difference is now that the Fairy's Embrace casts are called Seraphic Veil. But the heal for the exact same amount is Embrace now in Endwalker, but the Seraphic Veil casts add a shield equal to the same amount of healing as they did. So you have a 180 potency heal, you have a 180 potency berry applied to that target too, so that's 360 potency worth of sustain. Very powerful. Remember, Physick as itself, which is an on GCD heal with a full cast, is still going to be only 450 potency of healing. Again, this for free at a concurrent to your own GCD. Now the other feature is that SERAPH gets the ability called Consolation, which can be executed twice to apply a party-wide area of effect, heal, and shield that can stack with your other barriers. So we're talking like Adlo, if you spread it with like deployment tactics. We're talking about Succor, it will stack. Only limitation is Consolation of course doesn't stack with itself. It will override its own barrier. Regardless, you can think about SERAPH as simply a supercharged Eos or Selene, which is extremely powerful. The amount of sustain that you get from SERAPH is genuinely obscene. So from the stats alone, we can see Seraphic Veil and Consolation from the Big Fairy that can only be summoned for 22 seconds every 2 minutes, added up to pretty stupid levels from the top raters in terms of HPS. Now we're into the second mechanic, which is time to talk about Aetherflow. Aetherflow is a 3-charge system represented on the HUD here, where each charge lights up in green, and if it's spent, you lose a charge. Aetherflow is an extremely important mechanic to the Scholar because it enables the Scholar to use extremely powerful off-global cooldown abilities that enable the Scholar to pressure and add more damage by spamming in, obviously, more BROIL spells. Oh, BROIL. BROIL. Now if you've heard my Sage video before coming to this one, then you know my thoughts of the off-global cooldown window is that it is extremely vital to get to used to for your success. The Aetherflow system is really going to enable this by providing you off-global cooldowns that really help open up the ability to DPS more, especially the Aetherflow system. Sacred Soil is insane. And so before I get into that, let me say that BROIL in Endwalker has a 1.5 second cast time, and so every single cast of BROIL has a 1 second weave window that you should be using to maximal effect. This means get used to slide casting. This means get used to using that window to move. That means get used to a single, just not two because you'll clip, but one single off-global cooldown weave between each BROIL. It's going to be very powerful in Scholar. Let's talk about builders, ways to get Aetherflow. And so builders of the Aetherflow gauge can only be cast during combat, so you can't gain charges outside of combat. So let's say you're in a dungeon and pull pack to pack, and basically during that downtime between the 2 packs, you're still going to retain charges. Like, the game won't strip them away from you if you're already in an instance, but if your raid wipes because of a boss, or you, how to say it, you re-instance a particular instance, or you change maps, you're not going to have those charges anymore. That will take them away. So when you're in combat, you can use either Dissipation or Aetherflow to regain 3 charges of Aetherflow. Let's talk about Aetherflow, which is a part of the Aetherflow mechanic system. I know, guys, we're talking about Aetherflow, here, I get it. Let's see if I can say it 9 times fast. Probably not. So Aetherflow has a 60-second cooldown, and when pressed will immediately give you all 3 charges of Aetherflow. Note that if you already had Aetherflow charges when you use this ability, like say you had 3 unused charges, that they will be completely and utterly wasted. You will not say overcap to 5 or 6 or 4 Aetherflow charges. The max is 3, hard cut off. That exact same maximum limit of 3 applies to Dissipation, where you cannot overlap Aetherflow no matter what the condition is. So Aetherflow in particular is an ability. We're talking about the ability Aetherflow. No, it'll get a little janky, guys, I'm trying here. But Aetherflow in the ability is an ability that you use immediately at the start of an encounter. This must be a high priority in order to get the cooldown running on the ability. You should really be thinking every time that you have an ability like this that you're essentially wasting charges whenever you don't have it ticking. 60 divided by 3 charges means roughly every time you don't have it ticking for 20 seconds on a cooldown, you're actually losing a charge. You could think about it that way, which is obviously very, very bad. As we really talk about Aetherflow, we talk about energy drain and other abilities. The Scholar, more than any other healer, which includes the Sage, has a lot more tools to justify spending Aetherflow ahead of time and making sure that they don't overcap charges. Scholar mains actually probably already know that I mean things like Excog and energy drain, but more on that in a second. So the second ability is Dissipation on a very, very long 180-second cooldown timer, and this ability has the drawback that we mentioned before. It's going to unsummon your fairy, and that's obviously going to reduce the background healing you produce to 0, since the fairy's free heal spam is going to be gone, as well as it unfortunately locks you out of all the fairy heals, meaning Whispering Dawn, Fey Illumination, SERAPH, Consolation, yada yada, those are all off the table. But like I discussed earlier in the con section, this is largely a choice that you need to actively make, and then you get away with for almost no punishment as long as you're aware of this trade-off and do something like blow all of those fairy cooldowns and then use Dissipation when they're ticking. There's nothing stopping you from using Whispering Dawn, getting it out there, then hammering Dissipation. Whispering Dawn's not going to suddenly be sucked into the void because you did it with all your party members. Could you imagine? The nice thing is that this ability will also amplify your healing by 20% for its very long 30-second duration. This unfortunately does not impact off-global cooldown abilities like LUSTRATE, Indom, whatever, which are, to say the least, exceedingly powerful in their own right. We have a lot to say about Indom, actually. Instead, this will just supercharge your on-global cooldown heals, Adloquium, and Succor. Oh my god, am I going to correct myself every time in this guide video? I promise I won't. I will just edit it out, but Succor. So this is a very powerful ability, since 3 Aetherflow stacks more and 20% heal boost can be incredibly disturbingly powerful in many situations. I think a lot of people underestimate this ability or overblow the drawbacks. Drawbacks, they're there. I'm not going to deny it. They're there. But I sometimes, I read things and I'm like, isn't this a little extra? Like, yeah, but it's like you're also making the choice for that. Sometimes I read posts and I'm like, that's extra. It's just like, you are the one doing the most right now. I'm like, oh, not that bad, guys. If you need to use it, use it. Dissipation is actually great. One thing that I do have that is very big criticism about Dissipation is, am I the only one that thinks that Lone Wolf would have sounded cooler than Dissipation? It's just like, I'm Lone Wolf in it. I don't have my assistant. Haha, I'm the Lone Wolf. Just me? Just me? Really? Darn it. So now let's talk about the Aetherflow Spenders. Since we've already covered up the builders and done a big build up to this section, it better be worth it, right? Like, that was a whole lot of talking. And honestly, it really actually honestly is. These are some of the most bonkers abilities in the game. I'm not just saying that. Let's start off this section with LUSTRATE, and this is going to be a spammable burst of emergency healing on a single target that, if I'm being honest, is probably the weakest Aetherflow spender of all, but on the flip side, I can guarantee you that this has been one of the best emergency life-saving heals in all of Final Fantasy XIV over the entire lifespan of this game since 2.0. LUSTRATE has definitely been high impact when used. Obviously, with 600 potency on a single target, it is not the ideal use case to spam LUSTRATE, but it's there, and it's really a testament to how a Scholar can really book it with emergency heals. You can, in theory guys, I'm not saying you'd want to do this, but in theory, pop 3 Lustrate, Dissipation, pop another 3. Not that that's a common situation or optimal, but in theory you could get like 6 Lustrates out pretty easy. In fact, if Aetherflow's about to go on cooldown again, you could get out 9. Really standard, very basic, like emergency heal. Now we're moving into Sacred Soil, which is hands down, bar none, gloves off, the single most broken healer ability in my opinion. I've even made a video just highlighting this bonkers off the wall ability, and yes, it is coming with us into Endwalker, thank God. I agree, neutral sect from the Astro is strong, but it is on a 2-minute cooldown timer. Sacred Soil is on a 30-second cooldown timer, lasts 15 seconds, meaning that it can have literally 50% uptime of its insanely strong effects. Let's talk about those effects. The first effect is 10% mitigation, which is very great because you don't need to heal damage that simply doesn't exist. The second effect is 100 potency of healing tick over 15 seconds, so 15 divided by 3 because we have heal over time and damage over time effects come in 3-second intervals equals 5 ticks, and at 100 quoted potency is 500 total potency of healing. Remember, that's in an area of effect, so that is insanely, super bizarrely strong, and when you consider that on top of background healing like the Scholar's Fairy, that is very, 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 very good. I have literally healed off the entire party many times in the past with just a single Sacred Soil and letting Eos heal off the damage, or Selene if you want Selene. Really just a color change at this point. But if I'm being super frank, in almost any form of content, we can truly justify using Sacred Soil off of cooldown. Of course, you will rarely actually do that, but often it can be justified. You're just like, oh, the tank was taking this damage, I didn't want to deal with it. Oh, there was a raid wide of here. Tank was pulling wall to wall. Incoming raid wide, consistent chip damage coming into the party. Honestly, this 1-2 punch of taking off the edge of the damage with the mitigation as well as the healing off of it is always going to be really strong. Next up is EXCOGITATION, which is commonly called EXCOG, and because my pronunciation is terrible, I'm gonna just keep calling it EXCOG. So this allows you to prepare a burst of healing ahead of time on a target. It heals for higher potency than Lustrate when it does eventually pop, so this you could think about as like a almost pre-planned trap heal that you plant on the tank ahead of time, and then when the enemy lowers the tank's health below 50%, boom, the trap is sprung, and bam, the tank is healed with a huge burst of healing. This makes, quite honestly, tank healing in dungeons pretty trivial because you can literally stop paying attention to them between Eos, Sacred Soil, and this ability. I am almost always surprised people consider White Mage stronger than Scholar for dungeons. Double weave, fully mobile, no cast time, Art of War spam, and let this rip. That's obscene. But EXCOG, in particular, if we're talking about EXCOG, let me reel it back, sorry. This is what happens when the Scholar in me just leaps out. So if EXCOG EXCOG has a unique effect with an ability I will actually introduce here called Recitation. Recitation allows EXCOG to be cast at no cost of Aetherflow and will make it so that EXCOGITATION will critically heal. So this makes that EXCOG a stupidly, bizarrely powerful heal that offsets even more healing when necessary. 800 potency of healing critting? Whoa, that's huge. This is why I say during a dungeon, you think I need to care about the tank with this on? No, the tank's fine. I don't need to care. I can pretty much zone out. But more on Recitation. I'm talking too much about it here in this one. More on Recitation in the Augmentation abilities, but the point is this is a very potent combination that you should be thinking about. Last thing about EXCOGITATION is that it is a justifiable Aetherflow spender. It's not ideal, but you can justify it. Like, let's say that Aetherflow, the ability itself, is about to come off of cooldown. 60-second cooldown on it, and we want to make sure that we don't waste it. We know every 20 seconds that it's off of cooldown, you're basically losing a charge of Aetherflow. You don't want to do that, everyone's Scholar. So it can happen that when this ability is about to go on cooldown that you have 1 Aetherflow charge left. You don't want to waste it since that can give you like even 10 fairy gauge, at the very minimum just 10 fairy gauge. Let's be cynical. Theoretically you could lustrate a random party member for that gauge, or alternatively why not just place an EXCOG on the tank? It's not gonna necessarily be the most brilliant thing unless the situation warrants it, which maybe it will, probably won't depending on the raid group, but EXCOG has been actually one of my favorite Aetherflow dumps. You're at least getting something. And I want to say, I realize energy drain is there, but to be frank, I am not turbo incredibly impressed at 100 potency of damage enough that I would actually prefer it over EXCOG. To be honest, I have gotten a lot more use out of EXCOG than which would allow me to have a bigger window to spam BROIL than 100 potency of damage. So I've kind of gained a net benefit of damage just because I got more broils in because of EXCOG, which broil 300, well 295, I'm gonna say 300 too many times in this video, but it's really 295 in Endwalker. That potency is literally triple the potency of that, and just because it really opens up more opportunities for me to cast BROIL. That's why I prefer it. But outside of significant raid buff window, I know in my own practice and in my own experiences that those Aetherflow healing abilities do bring up that. But we're gonna talk more about optimization and Aetherflow in like the opener section, where I'm giving you two really general, how to say it, unrealistic scenarios where you never use Aetherflow on energy drain, and another where you spam all energy, and then I'm ending that section with a third that's kind of in between. So I'm getting ahead of myself here. Kind of to wrap that up, I will get a lot more value out of like a Sacred Soil or an EXCOG versus an energy drain. Actually, I feel like since we've talked about energy drain into the grounded back, it's actually appropriate to introduce it here. So energy drain has been a staple of the Scholar until it was removed in Shadowbringers, and that was for a very short period of time until myself and many other scholars went "Ree." The developers thankfully listened to us and put it back into the game. See, while I do not want to oversell energy drain and say, oh, you always must do this, the 100 potency is amazing, I also do want to say it is useful. It's a spender that I do use. It has always been a reliable Aetherflow dump. Until recently, it used to deal more than 100 potency of damage, but this nerf has kind of started to skew me and many other scholars' opinion of really using Aetherflow on it a little bit, outside of especially outside of optimization rating, I should think. And let me try and be as honest as I can. Optimization rating, you will want to cast energy drain as much as you possibly can. It is definitely, with this BROIL weave, a DPS boost, but that is optimization rating, and 99.9% of raiders are actually doing progression rating. Even if you have cleared like the final boss 5 times, you still aren't at the level where you are like actively like optimizing. Talking about people with like 100 clears under their belt that are literally going for like the top 50 rankings on the final Savage boss. We're talking about like the bleeding world first top raiders on Twitch, and as such they are absolutely not on the same level as the rest of us peasants, and we need to still consider actually using Aetherflow for heals. So for any form of progression rating, you want to be a little bit more conservative with when and where you're going to be using Aetherflow, and simply throwing out an additional cast of something as powerful as Sacred Soil into the wind, like completely randomly, for like, how to say it, instead of casting the Sacred Soil, you're really just trying to get 100 potency more DPS, which is 1/3 of a BROIL. And in progression groups, honestly, I would be shocked if the group wasn't a little bit bitter over it, just like, oh my god, instead, like, as the co-healer, I need to now suddenly like cast another Medica because of you, so now I can't cast Glare on the GCD. It has this nasty interplay with prog groups. So what? Another thing is, like, even if the healer that you're with is okay doing that, you're making the run a little bit riskier for what, 100 potency of damage? And in my experience, let's say that you get 2000 potency of damage. So this is, note, 20 Aetherflow stacks on this, and remember, you get 3 every 60 seconds, so 20 of them is 2000 potency of damage, which made or broke the enrage. So note, 2000 is 20 casts of energy drain, 20 Aetherflow charges, 60-second timer, that's 6.5 minutes worth of Aetherflow being blown here. My honest experience has been that 2000 potency of damage is rarely an enrage timer. At that point, you've had deaths, weakness debuffs, people executing rotations poorly, people using skills outside the raid buff window that should be in the raid buff window, like a machinist with reassembled drill, or more other mistakes. Like, you will lose more potency than that if you're throwing chain stratagem outside of the raid buff window as a scholar. Always just keep in mind, that's a lot of extra cushy, comfortable, off-global cooldown healing that you are throwing out to optimize. And I just want to be clear here, because I always feel like when I talk about energy drain, people like take offense. I have nothing against optimization runs. In fact, they are very inspirational. Like, they are truly pushing it to the limits. But for the incredible majority of us, I would be lying in an ultimate guide for the Scholar if I said that, oh, popping energy drain's the best thing, pop it like it's candy every time you get it on energy drain. That will be punished in Endwalker by resulting in group wipes. There is just the cost versus risk analysis really heavily skews it to stop wasting it on energy drain. Your co-healer will also likely hate you. I speak from personal experience on that one, as the hated on Scholar in the past for popping Dissipation and my Aetherflow energy drains on openers, and co-healers were sometimes really not too happy with me. True facts. Me, but that's my opener. Them. So why do I need to now stop casting Stone myself to cast Medica 2, you stupid Scholar? And to this day, I don't really have a great answer for that. Now I've explain this in like nauseating detail that I guess kind of justifies it being in an ultimate guide, but if Aetherflow is coming back off of cooldown, Excog is on cooldown, I will actually blow energy drain stacks happily, eagerly. You bet I will take that chip damage better than nothing, as well as like fairy gauge, a little bit of health recovery to myself. Like, it's a good ability, but will I go out of my way to do it? In most situations, especially in prog, no. But this brings us to our last Aetherflow spender, which is Indom, and it is curiously, fascinatingly simple. It is 400 burst healing off of the global cooldown, so you can still enable yourself to DPS, especially with the broil weaving that we have in Endwalker. But the problem, the big, huge problem with Indom is... Wait, did you actually think that there was a problem with Indom? No, this ability is actually bloody brilliant, and in fact, when you check top rater runs, you can see that it's literally the #1 healing per second skill used. It is insanely, and I mean insanely powerful. Nothing is wrong with Indom other than the fact that it has a cooldown, which is still literally only 30 seconds in Endwalker. What the hell? You can practically feel the fire of rage from hundreds of forum and Reddit posts through the years demanding Indom to be nerfed when it was first shown in game. Fuming at me for saying that. I ain't joking though, with the way I read some of those forum posts, you'd have thought that someone assaulted their mother. The intense, passionate hatred Scholar got for Indom, and it's still in Endwalker. Heck yes. Now, the last thing that I want to mention for Indom is similar to Excog, the ability Recitation will let you cast it without Aetherflow cost, as well as it will guarantee that it will crit. Yes, you can guarantee that Indom, that AoE heal, will crit. As you can well imagine, there was a fierce uproar online about this, and a lot of people being very extra towards the Scholar. Never forget when Recitation Indom became a thing. Well, that's not fair. Scholars now have a ton of healing as well as barriers. Nerf them. I actually, and I mean it very seriously, I unironically got hate in game, and this was obviously years ago before I made a YouTube channel. I unironically got hate because I played Scholar in the past because of this. I'm not even joking. Now we're on the third core mechanic, which is the fairy gauge, and this gauge has a maximum of 100 charge and will gain 10 charge every single time that an Aetherflow ability is used, outside of when the fairy is gone during dissipation, because screw you dissipation. This is actually a quality of life thing I would love to see improved. This means that roughly every 60 seconds you can gain 3 fairy gauge from Aetherflow, because Aetherflow pops, you spend the 3, you gain roughly 30 fairy gauge every 60 seconds. And this can happen if you hold on to dissipation stacks, though you could theoretically start off the fight with 6 fairy gauge technically. Whether or not that's worth it to you is really personal preference. I'm going to be super honest here. If you're asking me, it's not. Similar to energy drain, I don't think that payoff for Rambo usage of Aetherflow is worth including 10 fairy gauge in. I just don't see the payoff, as you're going to see in a second. Now let's get into the fairy gauge spenders and the reward for doing this. And so in Endwalker, Fey Blessing no longer costs the gauge, which, not gonna lie, thank goodness for that, but this means that the single spender is now Fey Union in Endwalker. Fey Union is an ability that has been kicked on in the community, and I'm torn on it. Sometimes I can agree it is garbage, but on the other hand, it's nice. And now that we are including the broil weave, where we can turn it on and off without interrupting our broil DPS, I think I'm gonna use it more. So all Fey Union really is that it tethers the fairy to specifically a single particular target. This is the only way that you can really control the fairy. Only that target. Embrace spam on random party members is over at that time though, so like all of the healing is funneled on this target. Fey Union does, however, also heal for significantly more potency than Embrace, meaning that you can actually sustain a tank through a pretty hefty smashing with Fey Union. Or alternatively, you can use it for an enhanced pick-me-up on a party member between mechanics. Think about it as almost a more limited diet version of cardio for the Sage if you want. One thing that I say, or will say, that drives me absolutely bloody insane about this ability though is its incredibly stubby, short, stupid range of 15 yards. And no laughing at me when I say that. This is what has actually turned me off of Fey Union. Embrace is at 30 yards, and then this stupid tether is at half, meaning that the fairy needs to get close to tank when I use it, and it's not always really something that is going to happen, which is again another quality of life problem with it, which I realize maybe I'm inflating it unintentionally, but like when I'm speaking from the heart as someone who has used this for years, oh my god, sometimes I wonder why I press Fey Union. Like, take it when the fairy just sits there when the tank moves away, aka out of 15 yard range. The fairy's just sitting there being like, me, I'm a fairy. I'm like, yeah, that's great, thank you so much. Now I have lost Embrace casts because I hit Fey Union. Wonderful. So the last thing is that in order to turn the ability on or off, because remember, you don't want it to be just burning through 100 fairy gauge if you don't need it, then you need to issue commands off or on, which are going to be off of the GCD. Could I make that into a joke? So you need to issue the fairy command off of the GCD. That didn't land, did it? I try. I do try. So you needed to weave in Shadowbringers with Ruin 2 to turn it on or off. Now in Endwalker, the constant off GCD weave with Broil, now we're in the position where we can easily justify this turn on, turn off feature. So I do personally see myself, at least myself, or actually I see this in general, being an ability that is much more used by scholars for sure, because it was so much harder to really justify it when you needed to lose the potency from Broil to do a Ruin 2 weave. It was harder to justify before, especially because you need to both turn it on and off to use it properly. So personally, I do see this definitely being used a lot more. So in summary, for Fey Union, which is the spender and the only spender fairy gauge, it's got some really big cons to it, but when you do have the ability to make it work, I'm going to be honest, it's a real banger of an ability that actually does some impressive sustain. So when Endwalker really hits and we get to play much more with Broil and the weave window, I actually am looking forward to see how much more I use it. I suspect I'm actually going to use it quite a lot now. Unironically, I actually do. So welcome to section 2, which is going to be all about the abilities of the Scholar that we're going to be going from top to bottom through the DPS abilities. Then we're going to look at fairy abilities we didn't introduce before, then healing abilities from yourself. Then we're going to be covering augmentation abilities that really change up your playstyle a bit, and then we are going to end the section on role actions. So the first part of this is going to be on DPS abilities, and I'm going to be very frank. Scholar's DPS toolkit in Endwalker isn't any better than it was before. If you have played Scholar and Shadowbringers, it still is going to have the incredible majority, the mass preponderance of its cast be Broil. So what is Broil? It is going to be in Endwalker a 295 potency of damage in Endwalker. The only nice thing is that now it has a 1.5 second cast time, which means that you can fit one off global cooldown ability into this window, or alternatively use the window to move, or be sassy and then combine slide casting with this window to move a lot more. I recommend everyone to try and learn the Astro in Shadowbringers prior to when Endwalker hits to get very comfortable with this. Aside from that, there's nothing really to say. It still remains the main means of Scholar dealing damage, mass majority of their cast. The weave window, however, is going to be a huge game changer on the Scholar, and I do think that that will make the Scholar feel a lot better to play. I genuinely do. Even if you hear Broil spam, don't let that turn you off of the Scholar. I would still give it a shot. I think that this will make it feel a lot better. Second damaging ability is that now Ruin 2 is still here for the Scholar, and it does deal a little bit more potency, closing in the gap a little bit more than it did before, meaning that you're losing less potency spamming Ruin 2 than Broil as a Scholar. Note that interestingly enough, it is just a touch less, so you shouldn't feel as much guilt as you did before for really relying on it when you need to. All intents and purposes, you're not actually going to want to cast Ruin 2 though, unless you really need to. Like, say that you need to double weave rather than a single weave, you use Ruin 2. If you want to do wide sweeping movements from one side of the arena to the other side that you can't do normally with just slide casting in that 1 second window for Broil, you use Ruin 2. In fact, I know that the comments might mock me for it, but I do think that Ruin 2 is going to be one of the abilities that really makes Scholar feel unique to other healers. White Mage, Astrologian, and even Sage have nothing like it. In fact, if you look at Dia for the White Mage, its baseline upfront potency in Shadowbringers was 120. That has been halved to 60 in Endwalker. I mean, sure, for Ast you could use Light Speed, but that is off the cooldown, and do you really want to cast Light Speed when you have a random snafu moment with your static just to get in more DPS spell casts? Most likely not. Sage comes closest with Toxicon, but that does need Serpent Sting gauge charges that cap out at 3 to spend, and since that is really only something that they get from their on GCD Eucratian Diagnosis, which is their single target shield casts being broken, it is very incredibly unlikely that anyone playing the Sage will feel nearly as free as the Scholar when it comes to mobility. So I'm trying to think of how to say it, guys, and doing multiple takes of this is hard. it's kind of hilarious. If we're really frank though, the Scholar is going to result in being an extremely mobile healer because of Ruin 2. I know, it's not optimal, I get it, but anyone here who has done prog knows the frantic, oh my god, everything is going to crap, mechanics are flying everywhere, oh my god, I'm supposed to heal them, oh my god, I'm dying too. Like, if you've been through prog in Savage Raids, you know that feeling. So me, and I know many others, are in the mind that 220 potency is less than 295. Yes, 295 minus 200 is 75 less potency, but know what is even less than that? 0. And that is where Ruin 2 comes into play. Like, between Ruin 2 and the Fairy, I think one of the biggest features that is really standing out the most to me personally is that the Scholar is just going to be consistent. No matter what, if the entire team is being splattered across the floor or not, the Scholar can always have a solid baseline of throughput, healing, and DPS. I know people will disagree, I know it's not optimized, but that's exactly how these kits are starting to shake out as I see it from the media tour information presented in front of us, and I'm pretty sure that this in 6 months is exactly what other people are going to feel. I'm very, very glad that Ruin 2 still exists for the Scholar, I really actually am. Now, the last single target damaging ability for the Scholar's ability kit is BIOLYSIS. BIOLYSIS, lysis, or the cutting of bio. I don't know, I'm trying. But every healer in Final Fantasy XIV gets a damage over time effect that is instant cast and so castable on the fly for mobility, minus Sage, which needs to cast Eucrasia first, but we're trying to ignore that. But that also means that it's double weavable, and BIOLYSIS just ticks for 70 potency every 3 seconds over 30 seconds for a total of 700 potency. Very much the exact same feeling as today. It is the strongest single on global cooldown cast for damage that the Scholar has by a large margin. BROIL 4 is at 295 potency. It is more than double that, so it's going to be very worth noting that you want to get this in the raid buff window. More on that in the opener section below. I'm ending this section talking about Art of War, and so Art of War is an instant cast on the global cooldown spammable ability that deals plenty of area of effect damage to say the absolute least. This means that it can be cast while moving non-stop, and it allows double weaves. It is very, very powerful, and why I unironically do not understand why people don't find Scholar very strong in dungeons. I'll slap a Sacred Sword down and spam Art of War. I slap a Recitation X-Hog on the tank and spam Art of War. I pop a Lustrate on the tank as I spam Art of War. I place the Fairy Tether with Fey Union on the tank as I spam Art of War. I pop the big Fairy and Consolation Shields as I spam Art of War. This is unironically my actual favorite dungeon spammable area effect for healers. Holy Stun has depreciating returns, and it has an annoying full cast in melee range, which I realize many will disagree with me, and I'm totally okay with that, but I will take the Scholar's Kit with Art of War spam over Holy any day of the week. It is honestly a great ability. Honestly, the unfortunate one downfall is that you literally will be spamming it non-stop without cease over and over and over again in dungeons. I never said it wasn't powerful before on my channel, but what I have said and will say again is that it is very, very boring. I do miss Shadow Flare and Bane, but Art of War does get the job done effectively. If you're looking just for potent, effective blasting through a dungeon, you've seen it. Art of War is it. Unfortunately, this might not be what you lack for peak optimal performance, but you know what? This is what it is. Now it is finally time to talk about Chain Stratagem, the elephant in the room. Why is Cole putting it here? But while I realize it's going to be a little controversial to put it here because it isn't technically a damage dealing ability in itself, it is a damage amplification ability, I'm putting it here because in reality this is one of the major sources of the Scholar's total damage contribution to the group. I not really think of Chain Stratagem as a heal, I'm not really thinking about it as an augmentation ability because if we start going down that slippery slide, my ultimate guides are all going to be all over the place because augmentation, is that really the raid buff window? No, augmentation abilities, you get what I mean probably, though I'm gonna stop. What Chain Stratagem does is that it increases the rate at which a target takes critical strikes by 10% for 15 seconds duration on a lengthy 120 second cooldown. Likewise, this will line up with every second raid buff window to incredibly great effect. More on raid buff windows when we're talking about the single target openers and stuff. Pulling up FF logs for some numbers to back that claim up because you might initially see like only 10% rate, that's not much. But we can actually see from FF logs that that adds almost 2k raid DPS to the group, which is pretty great. To say the least, remember that it's on a 120 second cooldown timer last 15 seconds, and we're still seeing this spike of damage. It's really pretty good. In a burst situation, great. As a note about balancing, because whenever I mention this sort of ability, I notice that it usually worries people a lot, especially in the comments. The Final Fantasy XIV developers go a very long way to try and balance out the different jobs, and so when we talk about Chain Stratagem, it is incredibly powerful, but it is still kept within balance, where the Scholar isn't suddenly going to knock over and blow over anyone, or be knocked over or blown over by anyone else, just because they have Chain Stratagem in their kit. Things are pretty balanced here, thank God for that. Now this gets us to section 2.2, which is the fairy abilities, and so I'm not going to rehash the fairy characteristics in this section, which we already covered in excessive detail before, but instead I'm going to go down the list of the skills and really introduce them. So first off is Whispering Dawn, and this is our basic heal over time across the entire party, which is still an Endwalker at a generous 60-second cooldown. I say generous because when we pop open raid data, we can actually see that Whispering Dawn, in spite of its at first glance kind of weak potencies, right at the top of the list with our other heavy lifters of healing. Simple off global cooldown weave, which gives us more time to cast BROIL for more damage casts. How this breaks down is you have 21 seconds divided by 3, because heal over time and damage over time do it at 3-second intervals equal to 7 ticks. And so this is huge actually, and so this heals for 21 seconds divided by 3, 7 ticks. 7 ticks at 80 potency is 560 potency of healing. So what we're really getting at here is that in spite of the seemingly trivial value of potency, is that is still 560 potency of healing across the entire party without any real cost to us. Sacred Soil is at 500 potency too over its duration. So really between the Scholar and the Sage, a lot of these characteristics are very similar, even though they are like quote unquote barrier healers. You also should think about them in terms of almost being like regen healers in this way. It's like you really need to learn the patience and the art of balance with these effects, because they can very much add up with the background healing effect. In the Scholar's case, that's the Fairy Spamming Embrace. That's going to all combine together to a huge sum. So I cannot emphasize enough that you really should learn, especially as a Scholar, especially as a Sage, to let your heal over time effects run their course and do work. Don't burst heal with Indom after using Whispering Dawn unless there's another raid-wide AoE effect that's coming in. Let that really give it a chance to actually do work. I think that you'll be really surprised in most situations that is more than enough. The next fairy ability is Fey Illumination, that is a 10% healing amplification as well as a 5% damage mitigation. It says magic, but usually raid-wide area of effect damage as we know it in 14. Pandemonium you might shake it up, but as we know it in 14 right now, that's going to be magic damage anyhow, so I'm not going to really belabor that point. The point is more mitigation is always nice, and that healing amplifier, if I'm to be quite frank, is still going to be very powerful as well. It really enables both you and your co-healer. So remember, it impacts your co-healer too, which is very important. It allows you to both get out more healing. So that means bigger shields, bigger reactive heals from your co-healer, like a White Mage with Medica 2 ticks being higher. It is a very simple off global cooldown weave, and it just helps take a little bit of edge off. It's not going to be game breaking like Sacred Soil, but for sure this is definitely a worthwhile kit. Rather, I should say kit addition. So the next fairy ability is Fey Blessing. This is a 320 potency burst of heal to the entire party. It's simple, it's clean, it heals for the same, a little bit around the same as Sage's Prognosis, which is their basic heal. It's off the global cooldown weave. It's going to be very effective in helping alleviate area of effect damage, and it no longer costs any fairy gauge, which is very much worth noting for any current or long time playing Scholars. We know that, oh, this costs 10 fey gauge. Not anymore, so it's its own fully independent cooldown. Very nice, very nice, which means that we don't need to worry about having that fairy gauge, so probably another reason why myself and many other Scholar players will be using Fey Union a lot more, as well as this ability. The last fairy ability is one that I touched on very lightly in the fairy mechanics section. It's called Consolation, and so this can only be used when your big fairy, the SERAPH, is out and will do a large area effect heal, very similar to Fey Blessing, but will additionally apply a shield to all allies healed equal to the healing potency. And remember, Consolation can be done twice in a row, so it's very handy for alleviating successive mechanics in a row. If you came from my Sage video, think about it in similar terms to Panheima. Instead of just raw shields in a row, you have the Consolation have a little heal underneath the shield as well. And also, obviously, like all fairy abilities, it's an off-global cooldown weave. It has undeniably, pulling up raid data, undeniably proven to be a very effective HPS producer in raids. So in terms of translating it into damage situations, when I pop it in like an expert roulette, I can basically ignore the tank, if I'm being super honest. It's like a 2 minutes, oh, the tank doesn't exist in my brain for 20 seconds. Now we're getting into section 2.3, and we are getting to the personal healing abilities. We've covered Aetherflow, we've covered fairy abilities, and now we're getting down to the last few essential bits. First up is Physick, and I'm gonna be super honest, guys, I'm not gonna beat around the bush. You almost never want to cast this. It heals for like 450 potency. I still don't want to cast this even with the 50 potency boost going to Endwalker, and truth be told, you probably don't want to cast it either. Adlow is healing at 300 healing potency, which also applies a 180% berry on top of that to heal the target. That is definitely, as you probably caught on if you played Scholar for a while, that's a big percentage conversion increase, so 180 is a very big boost, which means that the berry alone for a single target is 540 potency. But this also gets into the weirdness of the fact that background healing is really enabled by berries. Berries are really something that doesn't result in overhealing unless your family spam heals underneath that barrier. This is a fundamental concept that any Scholar player knows at this point. This is a part of the value optimization, making sure that EOs can still do their work underneath. Why overheal, or why stop them from healing? Just enable it. So not only are you getting the 300 divided by 450 equal to roughly 66.6% or 2/3 of the potency of raw healing with Adlow, but you are also getting a shield worth 540 divided by 450 equals 1.2 times that heal. The basic Physick heals 450. We're getting 1.2 times that heal even on just the raw shield. So as a summed whole with Adlow, you are essentially getting twice the value with a single GCD, while also letting EOS have a job to do healing underneath the barrier. So I guess even though I tried to introduce Physick here, that was also the crash course on Adloquium. Never said that I did things conventional here, I'm so sorry. But this is still the point I want to make. You never, almost never, ever want to be casting Physick. It is not as effective as other options and doesn't even let the fairy do her work. You can buy more time with Adlow. The only time I could see you wanting Physick is unless you truly run out of MP, then you consider it. But I even believe in current Final Fantasy XIV, many players recommend that you take Physick 1, I just mean Physick in general, Cure 1, and Benefic 1 off of your bar. The only reason people haven't really said that about the Sage is because it has the Eucrasia system, which turns that button into their Adlow equivalent called Eucrasian Diagnosis. Otherwise, I am 99.9% sure that Sage players would all be like, I'm taking off this diagnosis off my bar. Take this crap off my bars, I need space. So now I'm going to briefly introduce the emergency button called Emergency Tactics. This is yet another reason why Physick is completely broken for the record and you shouldn't cast it. So Emergency Tactics turns your next cast of Adlow or Succor, I need to get better at that, Succor shield effect into a heal. This heal stacks with a baseline heal, so it turns them into burst single target or burst AoE heals. So now Adlow is 300 base heal plus a 540 potency heal is going to be 840 potency of healing just from Emergency Tactics Adlow. Physick is a terrible bad skill I see way too many Scholar spam in games still. Now we get into Succor, which is going to be the area of effect version of Adlow. Small heal plus barrier. The baseline heal is 200 potency, so that get it a little bit of a bump from Shadowbringers to Endwalker. Not much, but a little bit. But the shield conversion got a big bump to a 160% shield being put on top of that. So this means that we have 200 multiplied by 1.6 for that conversion is going to be 300 potency of 320 potency of barrier, which makes this incredibly useful for helping pad off damage. It also does stack with SERAPH's consolation shields, so that would be like a 320 Succor, and then you have a 250 SERAPH is going to be 570 potency of area effect shields. Like Adlow though, if you just want raw healing, flip on Emergency Tactics and enjoy. That turns Succor into a 200 plus 320 equals 520 potency area effect heal. Is that amazing? No, it's not. I'm gonna be honest, it's not. But it is good in a pinch, so remember to whack your co-healer with your book for making you use the skill too much and wasting your GCDs better spent on Broil though, if you need to pop it that often. So yes, that is all for the healing abilities that you can do. As you can tell, the massive, incredible majority of your kit as a Scholar is actually on the Fairy, which to say the least is very important because as a Scholar, you should always have the mentality of letting your Fairy heal since that is off of your global cooldowns. You're too important to stop casting Broil. That sounds so arrogant, but that is truly the Scholar mentality. And White Mage, and Sage. I don't know about Ass. I don't know if they're quite as headstrong about that. They probably are though with Malefic. More about that on the healing approach section. When it comes to the Scholar, they have a few tricks up their sleeve that can augment their playstyle, and this section, 2.4 on Augmentation abilities, is completely focused on them. Not talking about SERAPH here, but there are other ways of modifying different abilities. And so the first one up is Dissipation. So I did mention Dissipation before, but I want to really introduce it here again for good measure. I still say that it should be called the Lone Wolf ability. That would be cooler than Dissipation, to say the least. I'm the Lone Wolf Scholar. How are you? I got boosted heals and more Aetherflow. It just works better for me in my mind at least. While everyone in the comments just like, disagree. What Dissipation does is it gives you 3 Aetherflow stacks and 20% healing amplification that makes your personal heals, Adlow and Succor, heal a lot more. Do not cast Physick, I hate it. I was gonna make like a short video making fun of Physick and just casting it just to spite me. I want to make clear, this ability, Dissipation, does not impact Indom, Lustrate, or any off GCD abilities, so that means that it is very good for burst GCD healing or amplifying shields to pad incoming damage further. 20% bigger barriers is very nice. Like take Adlow, that's 300 base, plus 1.2, times 1.8 is going to be a 648 potency barrier. That's beefy. Also, we're going to be introducing other skills soon that makes that very impressive. But with Dissipation with extra Aetherflow stacks, those are always nice too. More great things like Sacred Soil. While it might sound brutal, I will absolutely, peace and love and tranquility, take Sacred Soil with its powerful mitigation and trickle heal over a fairy that has no cooldowns left. They popped Whispering Dawn, Fey Blessing, and Fey Illumination. All of them just went on cooldown. Then how can Embrace alone compete with Sacred Soil? It, to be honest, can't really. So I'll pop Dissipation, throw out a Sacred Soil, and a Heartbeat if I have that choice. Another Indom is great too. It's really about, because I did bring this up as a con in the fairy section, so Dissipation is really about more knowing when to pop it. Dissipation used properly is truly stupidly broken, but Dissipation used poorly results in angry Reddit and forum threads and YouTube comments telling me that I'm wrong and that I should never use Dissipation and that Scholar's busted. Trust me guys, I have seen some fudge. This gets into our next augmentation ability, and I don't know how to introduce it properly because oh boy, it's gonna buff an Endwalker to be lowered to 90 seconds. And me and Burning Out the Scholars are gonna have a field day with this one. It is called Deployment Tactics. Deployment freaking Tactics. Ooh boy, someone lied to the dev team and told them that Deployment Tactics was not good enough and we got a buff. And you know what, I am gonna take it and I am gonna run with it. Whoever said to the dev team to buff this, thank you. I'm not a big fan of Lion, but thank you. This is big. Let's not even get into the other buff, because it also got a buff because Adlow, as well as Succor, but Adlow in particular for Deployment freaking Tactics, has its higher HP to shield conversion, up from 125% in the current game in Shadowbringers, up to 180% in the Media Tour. Now that is some sweet, sweet, bad butt music to my Scholar ears. So what this ability does is it takes our single target Adlow berry and it spreads the Galvanize effect. Only Galvanize, not Catalyze. If you remember from Adlow, you get the crit shield that is separate from the basic shield. You will not spread the extra crit shield, only Galvanize. Anyone else remember like really messing mechanics with crit Adlow back in the day? Those were the days. Those were also the days that Summoner could remove Extreme with Titan. Oh god. We have truly had some very interesting metas. Regardless, reminiscing to the side, that can be a different video, not the Scholar guide. We remember that we are looking at this baseline berry potency that is a juicy, thick 300 multiplied 1.8 is going to be 540 potency berry. Remember that we can toss SERAPH on top of that for 540 plus 250 is going to be a 790 potency berry. I, to be quite honest, do not expect many raid wides to break through that, honestly. Peace and love, I just don't see it. Let's be full stupid. Let's go full stupid here and use Dissipation that we just talked about to amplify the Adlow barrier. 300 multiplied by 1.2 multiplied 1.8 for the barrier conversion is going to be 648 potency of barrier. Then yeah, you could toss SERAPH on that for 648 plus 250 is an 898 potency barrier. Oh, and then we can be even more stupid and add Fey Illumination into this too, because why not add a 10% healing amplification? 300 multiplied by 1.2 multiplied by 1.1 multiplied by 1.8 is going to be 712.8, and then you can add the SERAPH shield for plus 250 is going to be 962.8 potency barrier. Come at my barriers, bro. Meow. I may be stupid, but I'm having fun. I mean, like an hour into recording, I'm allowed to be a little insane, okay? Oh yeah, what if I introduce an ability here and kind of spoilerize my video and what I want to talk about later? Right now. Introducing PROTRACTION, which is a brand new ability to the Scholar coming in Endwalker, which applies a buff to a single target that raises their maximum HP by 10%, as well as going to amplify the healing done to them by 10%. Note that it is on a ridiculously low cooldown at 60 seconds, so pretty accessible, so meaning that this is an accessible way to apply another 10% buffer of health to a target. You could think about like the health boost as like a refillable shield. That 10% maximum HP is going to be like a 10% maximum HP refillable shield. kind of. If you want to think about it that way, that's kind of how I'm viewing it. The main thing is that it means that it can sustain itself through multiple hits as long as you keep funneling healing. As long as EOS keeps funneling healing, of course. On a tank with huge HP pool values, though, it's going to be a very, very powerful effect, even in tank busters or dungeon pulls. Even if you just want to like restore health, it's going to be very good. Like, I think that a lot of people are going to look at this ability when the media tour hits and be like, gross, ew, gross. I actually think that this is going to be very, 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 very powerful just for that effect. But now I want to get back to my barrier insanity with augmentation abilities. The Scholar can now stack all of these effects with another 10%. So we're looking at 300 multiplied by 1.2 multiplied by 1.1 multiplied by another 1.1 multiplied by 1.8 equals 784.08 of just the Adlow barrier. Plus 250 from the SERAPH is going to be 1034.08 barriers across the entire party. Now, in the great words of I don't know who, the barrier is even more thick than both Nicki Minaj and Cardi B combined. Now, we're trying to ignore a lot of the complexities, you know, those things that you just don't want brought up, like timings, the fact that you blew cooldowns, the stupidity, the dissipation, yet you still have SERAPH, maybe you SERAPhed early, or maybe you SERAPhed after dissipation. We're ignoring all those details, but the fact is that you could use this madness in game. You would probably suffer for it after because you'd be so running out of gas, but it is possible. I already introduced emergency tactics earlier in the video. It turns shields into heals. Point is, it's very great at turning Succor or Adlow into great direct heals. These will undeniably be extremely powerful as an option, just like it is today, but actually more so. Because remember, Scholar is getting far higher conversions on Succor and Adlow shields, and now Succor is turned into a 520 burst of healing across the party. So we're looking at 200 multiplied by 1.6 equals 320 barrier, 200 plus 320 equals 520 healing if you use emergency tactics Succor. And then Adlow is turned into an 840 burst of healing on a single target. 300 multiplied by 1.8 is 540 barrier, 300 plus 540 is an 840 heal. It's pretty nuts, honestly, in Endwalker with these conversion rate changes. It's really nice buff. Now, the last ability that I want to mention is Recitation for augmentation. And what Recitation is actually doing is that it will make the next cast critically heal. And for the two Aetherflow dependent abilities, will make it so that they do not cost Aetherflow. So this impacts Adlow and Succor, two on GCD shields, skills that we've mentioned earlier. This also then impacts EXCOG and Indom, which are two Aetherflow abilities from before. As you can well imagine, this allows the Scholar to do some crazy things like combine Recitation with emergency tactics with Adlow or Succor for a severe burst of health, like absolutely bizarre amounts of health. Or alternatively, you can just make use of those significantly larger barriers to pad in the incoming damage. Now, the two Aetherflow abilities that I did mention this interaction with before, but I want to go over it a little bit again because it is actually so critical for the Scholar. So EXCOG and Indom will have this Aetherflow cost completely waived, so you don't need to worry about that. If you have no Aetherflow charges on your gauge, don't worry, Recitation will allow you to still cast these. But above that, these two abilities will critically strike their healing, which makes Indom and EXCOG extremely, and I mean extremely powerful burst heals. I say it often, but I cannot stress it enough. A Recitation EXCOG during a dungeon run I can practically ignore the tank and actually get away with it. I cannot do that on any other healer, not White Mage, not Ast, and not even Sage, because this is definitely a Scholar only ability. I mean, the Sage does get Tarkol, which is going to be super strong with its mitigation, but it's not EXCOG. EXCOG's that triggered heal. It's beautiful. On the flip side, when party health is low, Recitation Indom is a very, and I cannot emphasize, there's a reason it's the #1 HPS skill in the Scholar's kit, but it's a very strong burst of health, really good one. Undeniably, Recitation allows for some honestly freakishly strong combos, but if one asked me what combo I lean the most into, it would be Recitation Indom is my most common use case, if I'm honest, followed by Recitation EXCOG, but primarily in dungeons, almost never in raid scenarios. And then I don't use Recitation that often for Adlow or Succor because I just rarely need that much insane burst heal or shield, but it can be something that you can choose to do, especially with emergency tactics, just to get as much as you can. And now we're into section 2.5, and you know what? I know that this is going to be a little controversial to have its own section for Expedient. I get it, but you know what, guys? Expedient actually makes me genuinely excited, and I'm not just saying that for the hype. I actually think that this is going to be very, very, very useful. I think that this is going to be a game changer, and I really do mean it when I say that. So this is on a fairly lengthy 120-second cooldown. I agree. that's huge, but its effect, I believe, is still outrageous. So for 20 seconds duration, note, 20 seconds, you boost the party's movement speed as well as give everyone 10% mitigation. Undeniably, 10% mitigation is super strong in an area of effect. This can stack with Sacred Soil. The tooltips haven't indicated any contra indication or whatever, or so basically you're getting like roughly 20% more mitigation. It's bizarrely powerful. The speed boost is really what is catching my eye here. This is why I think it's game changing. Currently Sprint is on a 60-second cooldown, it lasts 10 seconds, but this ability, Expedient, lasting 20 seconds, means theoretically the entire group could have enhanced mobility for 1/3 of the fight. That means 2/3 of the fight they're at normal speed, 1/3 they could be at boosted mobility. But let me explain why I come to that conclusion. So let's say that I chop Expedient in half, so 120 cooldown becomes 60 seconds, just the same as Sprint. Then that same 20-second effect becomes 10 seconds duration of effect. So adding Sprint to half of Expedient, as we just defined out there, because we made them both equal to 60 seconds, we get 20 seconds of enhanced movement speed every 60 seconds. 60 divided by 20 is equal to 3. For 1 total third of a fight, at any time, we can have the entire party go zippy. And remember that a lot of the fight time that is in that 2/3 is also going to be downtime where you're just whacking the boss, not necessarily a mechanic. Like, you're not necessarily going to need to do statues, or E12S lions, or terminal relativity, or something like that. Terminal relativity doesn't have movement. What am I talking about? I'm talking about like one of the like different relativities, like advanced relativity, where you're like running around, or basic relativity. You guys know what I mean. So while I don't think it will be necessary for prog, because that's not how our developers work, this effect will be undeniably very extremely powerful. This will take some edge off of mechanics. It is instant cast and it's an ability, so even between broil casts you can do this. This is off of the global cooldown, and so you can like just go crazy. Not to mention you can combine this with Ruin 2 and just run around the field like a madman. You don't, as a scholar, feel that restrained. You'll be losing 75 potency per cast, but alternatively you have the option when you want to do it. Other healers don't. Like, I cannot emphasize truly, the fact that this applies 20 seconds of movement speed to the entire party is nuts. Even 10 seconds would be good, but a solid 20 seconds in this Meteor Tour build is just whoa. So being super honest, there is no doubt that Scholar will find its way into many parties just for this effect, and I sincerely do mean that. Just to note, this is again just another layer of consistency on consistency that makes the Scholar, in my eyes, the de facto consistent healer. What they are doing throughout the entire kit is taking that edge off with guarantee that that edge is going to be off. Consistent fairy heals, consistent damage option Ruin 2, consistent party speed boost with this. I'm gonna have a lot more to say at the closing section, but like, oh, this is crazy. Now we're in section 2.6, which is role actions, and I'm just gonna very quickly go over the role actions for the Scholar. There don't seem to be any mind-blowing changes. All the healers get the same role actions: Sage, Scholar, White Mage, Ast, so I'm just gonna casually breeze over these pretty fast. First up is Repose, which allows you to cast Sleep on a target, and this can be useful on, say, open world maps like Eureka, or in solo content like Palace of the Dead, but generally speaking, not really a raid buff ability that you'd use. I desperately, as well as other healers I know, desperately wish that Repose was actually an interrupt of some nature, but alas, this lass is not kind. Second role action is Lucid Dreaming, and this is actually one of the most important cross-class skills for healers that should be cast as much as possible, and yes, I do even mean when you are high on MP in order to keep your MP reserves high. I cannot emphasize enough just how vital it is to essentially keep this ability on cooldown. It is very important, otherwise you're going to very likely run into MP problems later. Third ability is Sure Cast, which is another critical ability that allows you to guarantee your casts go off, which, sure cast, that's fine and dandy, but what this is actually very important for is in savage raiding, avoiding knockback mechanics and quote-unquote cheesing them to allow you to just avoid that mechanic. Not being knocked off the platform is very nice in many fights. Very important skill, very important, except it's Asuna, and Asuna is going to be a very powerful ability that isn't used as often as one might think coming newly to 14, but what it does do is it cleanses a debuff from an ally. It's useful things like E8S Shiva, where it casts some doomy kind of ice spell. Sometimes poisons are cast that need to be cleansed in different content, so it is ultimately worth a hotbar slot still. Next up is Swift Cast, and Swift Cast is very vital to healer, especially to healer. It lets you cast your next spell instantly, which is almost always Revive. This is a very notable combination because hard casting Revive sucks because it costs a lot of time to cast. It's very long cast time, but in a pinch, it will also prevent deaths by letting you, say, get off another burst of AoE healing while moving, so don't be too shy of using it for that use case. The final role action is the ability Rescue, and while it might be controversial to say this is actually excessively important as a skill to acknowledge and still keep on the hotbars, I'm gonna be honest, most raiders are technically progression raiders, mistakes happen, and this helps you course correct those mistakes by yanking a team member to your side. Think about it almost like becoming Thresh from League of Legends and be like, oh yeah, click the lantern, but now you don't need to click the lantern, I am gonna grab you. Or alternatively, instead of saving them, you could drag them off the edge of the platform. Your choice, really. Now we're getting into section 3, which is core strengths and analysis of the Scholar. The Scholar, we are in the fortunate position going into Endwalker that we already have a metric ton of numerical data to analyze to try and help us draw conclusions and help develop our understanding and intuition of the Scholar. This is a section purely dedicated to that analysis. So we're going to be drawing off of the top speed kill ranking Scholars that have defeated E12S Phase 2 and assess their damage patterns and healing patterns. So if you wanted the spreadsheet of data, it is available in the comments and pinned. If I forget though, bonk me on Discord because I am sometimes an idiot, if I'm to be honest. Going into the damaging section, I want to say something super clear before I dive into the details. This is optimization runs. We're talking top speed kills. In general, it is great to learn from and know what is or isn't strong, what are they doing. It is good to emulate the best of the best. That's why I'm even talking about it in the first place. But I do want a disclaimer that I don't think that this method of spending Aetherflow is the best idea for most progression groups, let alone newer Scholars. You really do need to change your mindset from optimization to progression gameplay. When you're hitting an enraged timer, you need to go from progression mindset to optimization and seeing what corners you can cut. I should have a video on my channel talking about this sometime soon. I don't know if it'll already be up, but it's actually probably going to be after this video. The gist of it is when you're progressing, you need to acknowledge people will make more mistakes, and because of that, it is important, especially as a healer, to play very defensively. This means applying extra barriers, this means applying extra mitigation, this means keeping your emergency tools when you need them. And Aetherflow as a Scholar is your most precious, golden, most powerful, amazing resource, which includes spenders like LUSTRATE, which is the capstone emergency heal that has been identified as emergency heal since the days of A Realm Reborn. And while it's not the most potent heal, just because of its speed and how you can fire it off so fast, it's really good. Alternatively, why don't you use that Aetherflow for a Sacred Soil to help take off some pressure from mitigation and that trickle healing in AoE? And I mean, Sacred Soil, it's busted. It's honestly kind of busted, guys. I'm not gonna sit here and BS you on my own channel. Try and keep it real, and Sacred Soil, you can almost always justify it in some way. Maybe it's not the ideal case sometimes, but it can almost always be justified. So my point is, remain in a progression mindset if that's where your raid is at, and take the energy drain spam with a big grain of salt. So in terms of damage casts, BROIL made up the incredible majority of damage spell casts at an average of 115.2 casts, and from top Scholars this amounted to an average of 8,329.13 DPS, and that is just from BROIL alone. Going into Endwalker, this BROIL spam gameplay is not gonna change at all. That is still going to make up the absolute lion's share of casts. However, one thing is unique in that BROIL, with its cast time being reduced to 1.5 seconds, now is opening up a 1 second off-level cooldown leave window, meaning that into Endwalker, BROIL is going to be taking up even more casts, likely dipping primarily into the number of Ruin 2 casts, since the Scholar's current weaving tool is Weaving tool is Ruin 2. Say that 5 times fast. I can't. The next highest damage contributor is going to be BIOLYSIS, which is going to be a 30-second damage over time effect, which averages just under 2.4 thousand DPS contribution. An interesting thing to note is that BIOLYSIS is only making up 28%. What we're looking at is basic math here. 2358.51 divided by 8329.13 is going to be equal to 0.28. aka 28%. So this speaks volumes about how much BROIL is really carrying your damage. Even the next following up skill is only raking up roughly 28% of the damage. So the next skill at spot 3 is going to be Ruin 2, which is making up 1.7 thousand DPS contributions. Again, this is a significantly less number than BROIL and even BIOLYSIS. What is interesting to see is that we can see that the average number of casts was 35. Comparing this though to BROIL, we can see that when we equalize the damage contributions, we get 8329.13 divided by 115.2 is going to be equal to 72.3. Then Ruin 2's number is 1713.4 divided by 35 is going to be equal to 48.95. The main takeaway from this, which is not going to be that surprising, is that Ruin 2, even when you equalize it, the DPS to the cast is significantly less powerful, which is not surprising at all if we're trying to be quite honest. What made Ruin 2 such a plentiful cast in Shadowbringers was purely the fact that this was the skill that enabled weaving weaving and mobility for the Scholar, because the 1.5 second broil cast time is a brand new thing in Endwalker. Kind of translating this in different terms is seeing it at 35 casts on average means that these Scholars who are at the top end of optimization gameplay still needed to weave or mobility, although unlikely much mobility because they're mastering slide cast, but a minimum of 35 off-global cooldown weaves. Like I stated before, there is absolutely no denying that the number of Ruin 2 casts in Endwalker is going to decrease with the broil changes. However, I can speak for myself at least when I can say that I see this becoming an extremely powerful and handy progression tool because it allows the Scholar to contribute some form of significant damage to the fight. Optimization, it is not. Broil 4 potency is in the media tour at 295 potency. Ruin 2 potency in the media tour is 220. This means that there is only a 75 potency loss. Compared to doing no potency when crap hits the fan, though, this is a significant improvement that makes the Scholar flexible. So there is still a spot for Ruin 2 for sure on your hotbars. Not Physick, but Ruin 2, yes. Now we get to energy drain that I've disclaimed over and over again, and I'm gonna avoid another repeat of that, but I wanted to show you the numbers here. We can see that energy drain contributed under 600 DPS through the fight, in spite of it making up over 23 casts on average. But that means that instead of 23 casts of Sacred Soil, Lustrate, EXCOG, Indom, energy drain was going to be used. And that's very significant when you consider that the fight lasts roughly 8 minutes, so 8 multiplied by 3 is going to be 24 stacks from the Aetherflow ability, since Aetherflow is on a 60-second cooldown timer. Of course, Dissipation can be included in here, like obviously guys, but regardless, this means that the incredible, and I mean incredible majority of casts using Aetherflow from these Scholars was to energy drain, and that amounted to 600 DPS. That is all that amounted to, and this is why I state this is very much an optimization strategy. This is not something that you want to do in normal progression raiding. Very likely, if this is the reason that you made an enrage timer or did not make the enrage timer and wiped due to enrage, one of the following probably happened. First of all, players died. Second of all, pots weren't used, food wasn't used. Third of all, weakness debuffs were applied to players. Fourth of all, rotations were poorly executed or aren't known by the players, and so they just need to be a little educated on that. Or fifthly, raid buff windows are not being respected, which they should absolutely be. I want to cap this off by saying, don't get me wrong, in standard Scholar gameplay, even I can justify a ton of energy drain usage, but to this level is certainly a buyer beware kind of deal. Now lastly, we're arriving at Chain Stratagem, which is contributing an average of 1.5 thousand DPS, which puts it around the same as Ruin 2, which is our weavable spell. While it is not earth-shattering like we discussed in the Chain Stratagem introduction section, it is undeniably very powerful, and in many ways allows the Scholar to just be very consistent with their execution of broil spam. And I know when I said that I got a lot of Scholar mains cringing. Trust me, I did too. Oh god, broil spam. I'm so sorry. What it really does allow the Scholar to do is be very consistent with their DPS rotation. There's not much that you can mess up, guys, other than Chain Stratagem. So that perk of Chain Stratagem is that it is an off-global cooldown ability, and hence it's very easy to place and then forget. It's place and forget damage that contributes to spiking up the raid buff window, which makes it powerful. Throw out and forget ability for huge rewards. Big perk, and makes the Scholar's approach to combat very consistent. I'm trying, guys, I can't do this. The one drawback, though, to this is that your group may unfortunately not be as consistent in how they use your ability, the Chain Stratagem, because remember, if your group is like wiping, they all have weakness debuffs, your Chain Stratagem is going to look horrible. Now we're being brought to the healing kit of the Scholar analysis, and there are too many abilities to comfortably discuss every single one in detail, so I'm going to highlight the key points. So the number one ability is Indom by a significant margin at 3k HPS per contribution, which is huge. Remember that this can be combined with Recitation to make it crit and cost no Aetherflow every 90 seconds. Going into Endwalker, this monstrosity of a skill is still obscene. Next up is going to be Sacred Soil, which is an Aetherflow Spender that still costs Aetherflow and can't be cheesed out using Recitation. 10% mitigation, as well as this HPS is glorious. Third up is the incredibly underrated Whispering Dawn that looks at first glance like garbage. This is actually going to be something that I will stress in the healing approach section, but undeniably that minor potency ticking away adds up significantly. The fourth major contributor is going to be Embrace, and incredibly worth noting with Embrace is that its max HPS value for one of the top Scholars was a bewilderingly large 2k HPS, but even on average it is the fourth highest HPS contributor. It speaks volumes to that background healing truly taking off the edge of healing, and that is at no cost or effort from you, truly a huge Scholar benefit. benefit. This is then followed up by Consolation that applies that heal and shield to allies when you have SERAPH out, and likewise this will include the Seraphic Veil up here as well, the separate one. To say the least, very significant effect, very powerful. Next up is Galvanize, which is going to either come from Adlo or Succor. That's just the basic shield component, not the crit shield. Looking at the rest of this data though, it's clear that it's probably mostly from Succor usage to shield the team rather than Adlo. And then next up, finally, is the final skill that I want to touch on, which is Fate Blessing, which is incredibly underrated because they look at the basic tooltip, they're like, small heal. Yeah, it is, but in Endwalker, with buffs to it removing the fairy gauge cost, it's going to become more accessible than ever, low cooldown at 60 seconds too. Truly, Fate Blessing is going to be a really powerful tool worth popping often. 60-second cooldown, that's free real estate, free fairy estate. Welcome to section 4, where we're going to be talking about openers and rotations, and we're going to be going over both single target and area of effect rotations. I cringe at saying area of effect rotations. Scholar players already know. So I'm not going to explain in depth the abilities because they've already been introduced formally and I want to reduce the bloat here. Now whenever you're talking about any opener, any rotation, whether it is from a YouTube video, article online, Discord, or anywhere, you need to run a litmus test on it first. Think about it like a sanity check to make sure that it makes sense. To be honest guys, the numbers in this game, if I'm to be frank, are very at face value once you learn what to look for. The number one litmus test is to respect the raid buff window, and does what you look at respect it. And I will say in every Sage, or rather every single ultimate guide video that I do for any job, respect the raid buff window, even as Scholar, especially as Scholar actually, because chain stratagem placement is vital. So the raid buff window is the time when the entire group at the same time pops all of their group buffs, all of their personal buffs, they pop damage enhancement buffs on the raid buffs, they are going to be using all of those effects at once, and they slam their most powerful on global cooldown and off global cooldown damaging abilities into that target. This all stacks up together and causes a brutal spike in damage. So this is more than just important, it is vital to group progression success. The difference between a well-executed raid buff window and a poorly executed one is staggering. Not just noticeable, staggering. So enough of that, let's define when this raid buff window opens. This window usually happens a few global cooldowns after the initial pull of the boss. I personally go off of Dancer's technical step being finished, because at this point that 5% damage wide buff is applied to the party, which as you might well expect synergizes very well with your chain stratagem buff that increases the critical hit rate. So Dancer's technical step takes roughly 5 seconds or 2 GCDs to get out in full, but while we might like to state things as exact facts, we need to take into account that not all players will be perfect, and you will, at some point, generally speaking, probably encounter raid groups that are a little jankier. Maybe they have their own method to do it. You never know. You see all these things after a few years. The main thing is that not all players, not all groups are perfect, and it's really vital to know what your group is doing and what your group's particular bottleneck to get raid buffs initially is. If you consider like having no dancer in your group, then you might want to use a different timing setup, but generally speaking, it is pretty standard to have your 3rd to 4th global cooldown that is going to be getting into this raid buff window. Any later than that and you're probably already in it. So at this point, we're usually going to be going off of Ninja's trick attack. The community just as a whole really formed the entire notion of the raid buff window off of this ability. So trick attack lasts 15 seconds, so 15 divided by 2.5, that's the GCD, equal to 6. Like I said, the math is not too bad at all, guys. So this means that we can fit 6 on global cooldown abilities in a raid buff window once it has opened. So this means that your 6 highest damaging on global cooldown abilities should be slammed into here as hard and as fast as you can possibly get them in. This also includes weaving any off global cooldown damaging abilities, which as a Scholar you already know is Energy Drain. And as a Scholar, you know your number one most powerful on global cooldown ability is BIOLYSIS, which is not going to come as any surprise because the rest is basically BROIL spam. We already know that BIOLYSIS 30 divided by 3, 10 ticks at 70 potency is 700 potency of damage. Now one thing that is also important to note about the raid buff window is that it is considered to be open at exactly 60-second intervals after the first one, meaning say 0 seconds, 60, 120, 180, 240, 300 seconds. You get the point. It has always been the vital pulse to the raid team and rating really in Final Fantasy XIV, but in Endwalker the developers have stated that they are going forward with this ideology into Endwalker in full, going in completely actually changing some abilities cooldown timers just to line up with this, which as a scholar, your big raid cooldown chain stratagem is 120 seconds cooldown. BIOLYSIS is 30 seconds duration, meaning that every second BIOLYSIS will fit into the general 60-second raid buff window. Likewise, chain stratagem is going to fit into every second raid buff window. Now I want to talk about Aetherflow. As much as I do want to discourage especially newer scholar players from just spamming energy drain in Endwalker, it is also on a 60-second cooldown window, which does enable energy drain spam. Buyer beware. Beware if you do this. Then the rest is just furnished out with broil spam. I'm sorry, fellow scholars. It's still broil spam. So for the scholar, keeping track of the raid buff window is actually extremely easy. It is actually very, very easy for you. Since I'm of the mind where I value my sanity and keeping track through internal timers built into your kit, I keep track of it by two means on the scholar. First up is I'm casting BIOLYSIS on the raid buff window, which means that BIOLYSIS will first end at the 30-second mark after the raid buff window, so halfway point to the next one, and then the second refresh will end in the next raid buff window where I refresh it in that buff window. The second tracker is simply Chain Stratagem, which has a 120-second cooldown timer, so when it's off cooldown, you know you're in a raid buff window, every second raid buff window. Alternatively, when it's at the halfway mark on the cooldown, you know you're about to enter the raid buff window, if not already there. So really, above anything else or chip damage potency values, making sure that you get your Chain Stratagem off at the right time for the raid buff window will massively, and I mean massively, add value to the party. Even though it only lasts 15 seconds, it has a long 2-minute cooldown timer, and the data shows that it makes up a significant chunk of damage. Play well with your group members and it pays off in spades. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough, like thinking about like even on Machinist, I'm looking at reassemble 55-second cooldown, then I know my third drill is going to open up the window. As a scholar, you have much clearer tools to keep track of it, so make sure you use them. So let's get into single target first, and generally speaking, as a scholar, you want to start out the content by applying Adlow to a single ally and then using deployment tactics to spread the shield. This is easier in Endwalker to justify due to that 90-second reduced cooldown. This will be incredibly handy because most fights start out with some bitterly painful area of effect spam. If that's not the case sometimes, then of course consider using it elsewhere. Remember, cooldown placement is incredibly fight dependent, so I'm kind of cringing at myself saying, yeah, use deployment tactics here. If your concern is about a raid wide somewhere else within that 90-second cooldown timer, just consider applying a Succor. It costs no GCDs from you and you lose nothing from it. Simple cast. The first off is Aetherflow Conservation, which is going to make sure that you have the most resources at your disposal for emergency heals. This is so actually the approach I would take when you are still progressing a fight. I know people will disagree with me, but definitely I am of the mind that it's better to see mechanics than to worry about DPSing before you even know what an enrage timer is, or let alone the midway point of a fight. So now that we are going to go into the pull with this Aetherflow conservation method, it is common to pop your mind potion at the start pre-pull and then start pre-casting before the pull broil. Note 1.5 seconds cast time is pretty short, so be careful to not early pull. The group does not appreciate that, and then this is getting into some damage ahead of time. At this point of time, you're still ahead of the raid buff window. It hasn't opened yet, so immediately pop Aetherflow in between that weave, between the two broils, your next one coming up, to get 3 stacks of Aetherflow. And remember, it is very vital to keep Aetherflow on cooldown at all times. At risk of repeating myself, it's almost always better to blow a Sacred Soil to mitigate damage and provide some trickle heals or an early excog than to waste Aetherflow stacks. You can look at Aetherflow as every 20 seconds that it is not currently running on cooldown, you're basically losing one of those. From here you get into the second broil, and just because of MP concerns, I usually consider popping Lucid Dreaming here sooner rather than later. Again, you might want to rather position this differently if you rather have it later, but generally speaking, I like popping it sooner. Similar ideas to before, you just want to keep that MP recovery ticking through the fight so that you can get the most you can from it. The worst thing is to use it at 0 MP and really struggle. Just getting a lot more MP over the course of the fight by just popping it on cooldown. Now from here, I know a lot of people will disagree with me, but BIOLYSIS is our strongest hitting single global cooldown at 700 potency and damage over time effect snapshot debuffs. So I'm really wanting to save that for the raid buff window. This means that the next 2 to 3 casts are all going to be broil. This will open enough time up for the raid buff window to fully open, and if you recall, I mentioned earlier, you need to run the sanity check against your group with regards to when you use BIOLYSIS, when you use Chain Stratagem. If your group is popping them after say a 4th global cooldown, then make sure you follow their lead. Don't blindly follow a rotation into gimping your group and screwing you out of a clear. As much as it might be ideal, as much as you might be quote unquote correct, you need to, as a better player, be able to adapt, right? I cannot stress enough, this isn't a one size fits all kind of deal. So from there you cast BIOLYSIS into the window, 700 potency on the GCD. Remember, you only get 6 GCDs from the standard trick attack window at 15 seconds divided by 2.5 is 6, and then ensure that you immediately pop Chain Stratagem when this raid buff window opens right at the start. Really, one of your big goals as the Scholar is try your best to get it in sync with the other 15-second buffs like Ninja's Trick Attack or Astro's Divination. From here, spam Broil ad nauseum. So in closing for this first one, I want to say that obviously the Aetherflow conservative version, where I recommend you lean more into that, especially for early progression before you hit enrage timers, where you as a healer really need to start changing your mentality from keeping the party alive to just see further mechanics and learn, to now you're starting to strip down the amount of heals, shields, and mitigation to really push that enrage timer. And it's at that point that you start to consider swapping or pushing your style more into the other method, the Aetherflow dumping method. So now we're getting into the Aetherflow dumping method, and I want to say that I do open up the same as before. Precast shields, use your mind potion, precast broil to align with the start of the pull, immediately pop Aetherflow. Exact same thing. Now we patiently waited a few global cooldowns for the window to open the same as before, but now when it does open, broil, Chain Stratagem, BIOLYSIS, energy drain, spam broil, and then you weave energy drain whenever possible. Now here's where all scholars are like, yeah, this is a pain in the butt. And so why I'm saying whenever possible is because even into Endwalker, energy drain has its own internal infuriating cooldown of 3 seconds, meaning it does not always fit nicely for weaving in a 2.5. Also during the time when your energy drain is still on cooldown, yeah, it's just not gonna fit nicely. How to say it? You can try your best. It's really a you get used to kind of thing. When you run out of Aetherflow stacks, pop Dissipation, regain them, just keep slamming energy drain into the target. But like I said, it's a really do your best kind of thing. Just know that the last thing that you want to do is clip your global cooldown, since broil is 300 potency, energy drain is 100, so broil is literally 3 times more valuable. Also, I want to say, why am I leaning into energy drains after? Why would I be fine with them coming after the 15-second window has closed? Because 6 GCDs, oh my god, you might not fit them all in. Why I'm better with that is because sometimes you're noticing that some raid buffs, like currently you can see that Dancer's technical step lasts 20 seconds, so it is better to keep weaving energy drains after the 15-second window rather than before when no buffs are out, because at least you will snag some benefit. I want to capstone this section off because this is neither is really reflecting reality. Do I always go with a pure conservation method? No, I'm not about to start lying to you. Like, the reality is, to capstone this section off, the most raiders are going to be comfortable between the first and the second, not one extreme or the other. The entire key is to find out what your party is doing and what sort of Aetherflow demand that you have placed on you, and only keep that many stacks in reserve. But one scholar might find to be comfortable with their particular group, which might change from group to group, realize that, will be different, vastly different than another. Do you need to maintain recitation before it'll be back on cooldown? Do you know that you want to keep one Aetherflow in your pocket for Indom maybe? Do you need a Sacred Soil? Is your co-healer using their heals properly? Many factors go into this, but the truth is the answer for Aetherflow dumping or not is really purely dependent on your comfort level. There's no other way to say it. I cannot tell you, and I will not tell you or preach at you saying you need to do specifically this, because I feel that that's just ingenuous. You need to know your own comfort level, especially with something as valuable as Aetherflow. Really what it is get to your static, get to your group, see what the group does, because a lot of the times, quote unquote, your comfort level really depends on how your group's performing. If your group is making no mistakes, you can get away with a lot. If your group's making a lot of mistakes, you're risking running out of gas even if you are very protective and defensive over your Aetherflow stacks. I speak from experience, and it was painful. Much experience. Now we're getting into the AoE version of the Scholar's rotation. This is going to be incredibly boring. I know all scholars listening to this video are probably laughing their butts off, just like, oh my god. AoE rotation. I'm just trying to keep my guides really consistent, guys. I am so sorry. Spam Art of War. You spam it. I don't know what else to say. We don't really have anything else that does AoE. Spam Art of War. I am so sorry. While it isn't the most interesting thing, I will say as one takeaway is that it is very, very powerful. As we discussed when we introduced it initially, double weaving, totally accessible, total mobility, hits hard, very flexible, really strong, really boring, but really strong. It's the end result that matters, right guys? Hey there and welcome to section 5, which is all about the general healing approach that you should be taking as a scholar. And one thing about healing is that factually it's messy and it involves a ton of different factors. Is your co-healer helping? Is your co-healer not? Whack them with your book. Is it going to be a sage? Is it going to be a white mage? Is it going to be an ast? Is it gonna be dead on the ground? Does your DPS find the orange markers pretty and fly into them like a moth and proceed to combust? So when I thought about this approach section, these are just general recommendations, not a exact cure-all every situation fit, because good luck with that. This video would literally be probably like 90 hours long. So one thing that I want to make in this section is that I made a strong effort to make it so that this section, all of section 5, went from our highest priority heals to lower priority, little bit lower to absolute lowest priority, which yes, if you cast Physick, what the heck is going on? Stop casting Physick, it's bad. The first thing that you should do whenever it comes to healing is let your fairy take over. They want to be doing the work. They are happy helping you. That is your nurse joy, that is your helper, that is the good assistant that wants to help you. And you have, how to say it? You have no choice outside of mismanaging your fairy intentionally like dismissing her or throwing her into the worst corner of the arena you can for her to stop healing. It will be extremely, and I mean extremely consistent background healing. Let the fairy do the work. It will take a ton of edge and concern off of your plate. Like, even compared to the sage with the Cardia system, which is very, very good, you don't need to worry. The fairy will do the work. The real trick here with those first healing is you need to learn balance, learning what your fairy can and cannot heal off. I can't even really quantify it. Okay, let me try that. Objectively, Embrace is doing 180 potency every 3 seconds, and so over a 60-second duration it's going to be blah, blah, blah. That's not going to help you. It is mostly just you learning and getting exposure to the scholar, and then you have this like intuition build up over time where it's just like, okay, this fairy can do it. So it's really about learning how to balance yourself on the scholar. Once you learn that balance, so when damage comes in, you can sometimes flat out utterly ignore it and keep dealing damage. I have gone away with completely ignoring and offloading my concerns onto my fairy for years now. All of the memes about the real healer being Eos or Celine is true, and I contributed to that 100%. All the rumors are true, yeah. Sorry, I have that Lizzo song stuck in my head. Now for the second highest priority abilities, we're looking at pure raw damage mitigation. Second highest priority, why? Why is it second highest? Because you don't need to heal damage that simply doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, I'm not gonna pay attention. Scholar for a while, you will know what I mean when I say this. You learn when you can literally just look away and completely pretend as things are going to heck and it's gonna be fine. So raw damage mitigation comes in a few different flavors for us. Sacred Soil is always very accessible. We have Fey Illumination, which while it might not be insanely impressive, it can definitely take some damage edge off. And then we have the new ability Expedient for 10% mitigation on a long 20-second duration. Reality in this category is Sacred Soil is going to be your workhorse of this category just because of its accessibility. Tank running in to take a ton of damage, Sacred Soil. Massive raid-wide damage coming in, Sacred Soil. Shift damage coming in, Sacred Soil. Rapture from the Apocalypse coming in, Sacred Soil. Mother-in-law coming that hates you, Sacred Soil. Other two abilities, Expedient as well as Fey Illumination, are just when you need a little bit more edge above and beyond. Someone gonna meme me saying Mother-in-law with Sacred Soil. I'm thinking about maybe deleting that, oh god. Oh boy. 5.3 is off global cooldown healing, and third up is every scholar needs to have it drilled into their brain off GCD healing, and oh boy, with the BROIL weave window in Endwalker, this is more accessible than ever. We have actually gone mega buff in Endwalker with this. I'm gonna go through a brief flowchart of options here. So the first one is Fairy can heal damage. Okay, or no, go to step 2. Step 2, can you mitigate the damage so the Fairy can heal it? No, step 3. Is the damage that can just be healed off of regens? No, step 4. Minor bursts of off GCD healing, will that do the trick? if not step 5. Step 5 is, okay, now you need to bring in your stronger big burst of off GCD healing. So now let's go and flesh it out a bit. So first off is we know that the fairy can do work, a lot of it already established, but if it's not enough, we look to see if we can mitigate it, usually with Sacred Soil, which I acknowledge has its own ticking regen, which makes it absolutely insane. The 14 devs tacked it onto that blessed ability, and so thank you for this blessed busted ability. Now, if that's still not enough, then you need to ask yourself, can you resolve it through regens or minor heals? If so, weave in with Spring Dawn. Maybe you can use Aether Pack to funnel more powerful healing over time into targets, so that's the Fairy Tethered Fate Union. Remember that this is all off of the global cooldown window, so totally weavable. But if that is still not enough, consider going down to Fey Blessing for a minor burst of damage with a successful 60-second cooldown. Think about it as a big bump of healing. It's like the same healing as Prognosis or normal Medica. Or for single target alternative, Scholar has a new fancy dancy ability called Protraction, which also is a powerful sustain and amplification of healing effect that boosts the health of that target by 10% and heals them for the same amount, as well as amplifies healing on them. And it's on a 60-second cooldown timer. And that 10% HP padding on top can really be thought of as a long time barrier that doesn't just immediately smash that one time, but that you can replenish by healing under it. Simple sounding mechanic, great ramifications to it. It's just really nice and will be quite significant for tanks undeniably. Let's say that's still not enough. Okay, now we are starting to talk about more expensive options. Once you cross this line with off global cooldowns, now think expensive. Up until this point, cheap. Now we're talking a little bit more moolah. So now you ask, is Indom enough? Then Indom. If not, consider Recitation with Indom, being wary that 90-second cooldown timer on Recitation. Maybe here you start to consider bringing out SERAPH. Remember, 120-second cooldown, and then using Consolation to bathe the team in heals and shields. Maybe you should start to consider single target options as well. If it's something that you can pre-plan, use EXCOG on a party member. If it's emergency, LUSTRATE. Like, what would be a good case for EXCOG? Like, let's say that a party member is taking like targeted damage off of the party for a while, then you can EXCOG them. Absolutely resolve damage that way. Now, if it's an emergency you aren't pre-planning for, LUSTRATE, but generally speaking, you should always be thinking about how you can open up more breathing room to keep spamming BROIL as a Scholar. If you let your off-global cooldowns do the heavy lifting, this will result in more damage for you, absolutely. And I know that this is a little bit of a blurry line, but if you need even more healing, then consider a weave of emergency tactics, which is off the global cooldown, with Succor or Adlo for a very powerful burst of healing. I realize that this does require a global cooldown cast though to get off, so try and avoid it until fudge hits the fan. More on that in a sec. Now we're into the section where we get to talk all about barriers, and in particular I'm focused on the on-global cooldown barriers Adloquium and Succor. This is lower on the global cooldown healing because in an ideal scenario, you really won't need to cast barriers. I'm going to be quite honest with you, you generally don't want to unless you have to. It is generally considered good form as a healer to let the party's HP spike from 100% to even 1 HP. It's okay if they're screaming and flailing about, as long as your off-global cooldowns can heal them in time and they don't die. That's the main thing. But did you die? Nope, then what's the problem? But in a realistic scenario, especially for progression rating, you will absolutely 100% need to cast barriers to help your party to get further progression on a fight. As a healer, this is something that you really should be fine honing in on, and it's like the difference between when you're in a progression versus a more optimization styled run. A progression styled raid, more barriers. Less progression styled raids, start taking down the barriers, start doing more pew pew, start letting the HP of the party hit almost 1 as long as they don't die. But enough of that. Regardless, Adlo can be made stupidly strong, especially with the deployment tactics buff to 90 seconds and Adlo's base shield conversion percentage being enhanced in Endwalker, which is a double whammy that makes it insane. So meaning every 90 seconds you can apply a insanely large 540 potency barriers to the party. 300 multiplied by 1.8, 540. Succor will not stack with this, however. When deployments tactics isn't available, Succor though is going to be extremely powerful on its own, providing a 200 multiplied by 1.6 is 320 potency barrier. But like we kind of discussed earlier in the video, these can be further amplified by Fey Illumination and AoE 10%, Dissipation, 20% healing amp. You can use Protraction on a single target, that's going to be 10% more. Adlo on that target, deployment tactics, boom, huge shields. So really all of these different amplification effects can flexibly stack to make these shields go to bonkers levels of padding. We're talking about like, will that raid wide even break through the barriers sometimes? Like, we're talking those are going to have to hit very, very hard. Like these are big numbers and relative to current content, guys, very big. What is also nice about these shields is that they do play nicely with SERAPH's fairy shields, so Consolation 250 shield in an area of effect that can be deployed multiple times in a row. When learning how to stack these beefy padding shields, it's really important to think how you can combine them, how you can spread them out. What's the damage profile of the fight? Is it once every 60 seconds? Okay, I'm going to spread it once every 60 seconds with these cooldowns. I'm going to combine these cooldowns. That is really going to make you a very adept Scholar. I mean, to be honest, Scholar, relative to even the Sage, just provides the big barriers. That means that one single burst of damage is just going to be laughed at by the Scholar. I'd say another way that the Scholar is very consistent actually is just in that it can consistently get out those big AoE barriers on the entire party and pad out that spiked incoming damage at a pretty hilarious and reliable rate. We will admit though, with the Sage and Ham and Pineapple, that it does laugh at successive spikes of damage like over and over and over again through their shields, but they don't reach that same absolutely bonkers big beefy initial spike. We'll have a little bit of a harder time getting to that level of padding, which ironically enough, and I want to make a video particularly talking about this, you might, depending on a particular raid encounter or a particular raid series, you might want to consider swapping between the Scholar or Sage depending on the situation. So now we're going to be talking about what you need to try your best to avoid, which is on global cooldown healing. So last section we stated that there is for sure a use case for barriers, and there will be. They definitely are very nice even when they aren't needed just for progression, but there are going to be situations where they are definitely needed. I'm thinking something like currently in current content E12S terminal relativity that really whacks down the party. So conditionally necessary, and for progression essential to help prevent snafu from a party. But what we have here is just on GCD healing, and one option really becomes turning Adlo or Succor into big bursts of healing. Adlo becomes 300 plus 540, 840 potency of healing. Succor becomes 200 plus 320 equals 520 potency of healing. Neither of those are bad, but what sucks is that the healing hinges on your cooldown emergency tactics being up, which brings us to the two worst cases you can have for a Scholar, and I mean it. This is first up the concept of running out of gas. You have no off GCDs ready, you have no Aetherflow stacks left, and you need to heal up damage. Emergency tactics isn't up right now because say you just used it, and you're left to spam Succor for 200 potency of healing and a 320 potency barrier that the barrier isn't being used, that you're just overwriting nonstop. And spamming 200 potency of healing over and over again, I can't emphasize it enough. It feels miserable. It feels genuinely miserable, but this is what Scholars have been doing for years now since A Realm Reborn when they run out of gas, and it sucks. The single target alternative is Physick, and for honestly all intents and purposes, if you ever need to find a hotbar slot to unbind or free up, consider Physick. Its ability has almost no right to ever be cast unless you are completely out of MP and all other options. What the heck has your party done to you to rough you up to this point? That 450 potency of healing from it does absolutely nothing to help me want to cast it more often. Avoid Physick like the plague. This is like this worst case that you can be in is spamming it. So now to close the healing section off with a wrap up. As a Scholar, you have a metric ton of tools to essentially really pad out the space between your global cooldowns and really get your lungs to expand and push out a metric ton of broil casts, which means that we get a lot of focus on our energy into damage. Ultimately, the goal of the entire Scholar healing kit is to ensure that we are offsetting the amount of on global cooldown heals or barriers that we need to use. And while it is indeed funny to imagine, the ideal scenario is one where every single raid-wide doesn't need a barrier applied to the group, which will make your group writhe and scream and cry out in horror as their HP is lowered to literally 1. Which we all know as healers, the only HP that matters is the very last one. Which to say the least will scare your party, absolutely. But speaking optimally, that's the ideal. If your group won't survive with even 1 HP, try and mitigate the incoming damage with something like Sacred Soil that will also apply a slow ticking regen. But then if you use your off global cooldowns like Whispering Dawn or Indom or Fairy background healing to resolve the damage that was eaten, that is good too. But if somehow that's not enough, you now need to start considering applying barriers to pad that damage so you don't die. If say the SERAPH Consolation barrier, which is all off the GCD, remember SERAPH and their kit are all off the GCD, still isn't enough, consider applying Adlo and deployment tactics to provide that big beefy barrier. Very rarely should you be pushed to the level where you're worried about casting pure heals on the GCD, but when necessary you can also pop emergency tactics and something like Succor to help burst the party's health back up in a pinch, usually when there's going to be successive raid-wide damage. This gets into the final section of the guide, section 6, where I'm going to be flavorful. It's going to be a lot of personal takes and a lot of talk about my pros, cons, and general takeaways and thoughts for the Scholar after playing it for literally years and now getting the Endwalker kit. So people have asked me for my take on the Scholar. What's going on with it? Is it good? Is it bad? I've talked so much about the Sage, many people even think that I'm quitting the Scholar, which I was never fully convinced that I'd actually quit it. I mean, it's been 7 years, or yeah, it's been over 7 years now, 2013 for A Realm Reborn, my god. But with the full toolkit reveal, I can confidently tell you for an absolute fact that there is no way that I'm quitting it. In spite of a few flaws, and they definitely are there, the Scholar is extremely, and I mean extremely powerful. Now that we know the Endwalker toolkit, I'd say doubly so going into Endwalker. In fact, and I know unfortunately this will rattle some people, but I do feel obligated to be as honest as I can, especially on my own YouTube channel. I'm fully convinced at this point that the Scholar will be the #1 go-to healer for progression for many raid groups that are going to be demanding it explicitly for progression reasons. Starting out this video are going to be the pros of the Scholar. The first pro is going to be that the fairy background healing is undeniably strong and takes off a metric ton of pressure from both the Scholar and their co-healer, and this is actually going to be a game changer. It requires no effort from you to swap targets, it is flexible, especially when you get comfortable with the idea of placing in particular locations, and can allow you to get away with healing the party in AoE even if mechanics force you personally into different spots like a southeast corner as the party's in the northwest corner. To be frank, just a nauseatingly consistent effect. You actively need to try and sabotage it in order to get it to stop. Side of effects like dissipation, of course, guys. At that point, you're making the decision to do that trade-off. Second big pro is that the Scholar also has very consistent damage output. During a progression raid, sometimes mechanics are handled poorly, and this requires you to do wide sweeping movements, and Ruin 2 is better than no damage contribution and is really unique among the healers. Ast and White Mage don't really have anything even remotely the same. Sage's Toxicon is the closest to being similar, but that requires Serpent Sting charges to actually execute, meaning that that's going to be constrained, and the Scholar really has no such worry. They only sacrifice 75 potency. While that might sound a lot, isn't that a lot lower of a number than 295? So this really enables the Scholar to be able to make up and actually recuperate some of the damage loss when mechanics are handled poorly. The third pro is that Scholar has a rotation that is very hard, to be quite honest, to mess up. Outside of placing Chain Stratagem at the wrong time outside of the raid buff window, the Scholar has fewer keys to mess up than most healers. An Ass can place a card on the wrong person, the White Mage might not use Afflatus Misery or Ass Ice in the raid buff window. The Sage might use Phlegma outside of the raid buff window as soon as they get it off of the 45-second cooldown. In a very hilarious way, the Scholar in a high intensity raid environment is likely to suffer the absolute least from potential mess ups and really just be consistent in their throughput. Broil spam is boring, very boring, but effective. Now, the fourth pro is that Expedient is an obscenely powerful ability. Movement speed that lasts 20 seconds is very, very powerful and bizarre. This ability allows the Scholar to give the party, in conjunction with Sprint at a different cooldown, you can use them separately, 1/3 of an entire fight with accelerated movement speed, which is bizarre. So take a 10-minute fight, and just under 4 minutes of that fight can be party zipping around choosing mechanics and handling them easier. And as anyone who has done raiding knows, positioning, movement, mobility, that is really how you resolve a lot of the mechanics, and so enhancing positioning, movement, and that to resolve the mechanics makes the fights a little bit more, how to say it, the movement speed will not be mandatory, but it will definitely take the edge off. Anyone who's done something like Lions knows, okay, we need to go, at least my position in my static was, okay, I need to go to the far north in Lion, I bait the first puddle. I need to run all the way to the right-hand side, I need to then wait that out, then I need to run all the way back north. If I didn't have Sprint, that made that a very, very much harder mechanic to have. Scholars Expedient? I would take that in a heartbeat. I don't think that I'm alone in that. I know I'm a broken record, but again, this is just consistency, and again, consistency. Just to make sure that I clarify so that I don't lose people on why I say 1/3 of the fight. Expedient, 2-minute cooldown timer, 20 seconds. Sprint, 60-second cooldown timer, 10-second duration. Expedient cut in half is 60-second cooldown, 10-second duration. And so you just stack those up, and then you get 60 divided by 2 is going to be roughly 1/3 of the time. But of course, remember that depending on lull times during a raid, this is actually going to be more useful than just 1/3 of the time, because a lot of the time you're just going to be stacked on the boss. But I am totally going on a tangent here, so I'm going to cut it back. Fifth pro is that Scholar has extremely large shields against spike damage. The Sage can do some bonker stuff too, but the Scholar with deployment tactics and dissipation and Illumination, SERAPH can consistently volley out extremely durable shields, and with deployment tactics buff to only a 90-second cooldown and that Adloquium buff to convert 300 health potency at a rate of 180% means it's a baseline 540 potency shield that can be spread across the party. That's beefy. That's huge. Like, really big. So that makes it that the Scholar is the absolute king of big upfront barriers that will pad incoming damage with ease. Remember that the Scholar can also spread out these cooldowns too, so they can make up the gaps with pretty potent barriers. Dissipation with Protraction Deployment Tactics Adlow, valid combination. Succor with the SERAPH barrier, still huge. Toss and Fey Illumination and the potential really for the Scholar to volley out shields is flat out bizarre. I'm not trying to put down Sage's Panheima effect because that's still going to be strong, but when we're talking about cutting down initial big spikes, like single spikes, the Scholar has it absolutely in the bag. It's outside of spamming the Eucrasian Prognosis effect with Panheima, which is available every 2 minutes, what can they really do to spread the shields? Not all that much, honestly, unfortunately. They have nothing even coming close to deployment tactics. Now this gets into the cons of this Scholar. So the first con is going to be anti-synergy, and largely, I want to be upfront, largely this is something alleviated as a con through proper cooldown and timing management and being aware of the cons beforehand. Like, these are big quality of life concerns, but I don't think that any experienced Scholar is going to look at Dissipation and be like, oh, what is this? It's a pretty button. Oh my god, I'm pressing the button. Oh my, wait, oh my god, where did the fairy go? I'm so confused. What happened? I don't see it. You know what that button does when you're experienced with it. You know the trade-offs. And a lot of the time, they're absolutely worth it. You bet when the fairy has no cooldowns, I'm gonna do that. But I digress. So the first con is that Dissipation removes your background healing, your fairy's gone, and it logs you out of any fairy abilities. Huge anti-synergy, but the rewards are a huge 20% healing amplification for Adlow or Succor, making some gnarly combos like mentioned before, as well as 3 Aetherflow stacks, and you bet when the fairy has no cooldown, I will absolutely chomp them, I will shove them in my mouth, chomp that fairy, and get that 3 Aetherflow and place down Sacred Soil. Second con is that you have no fairy control, and while the fact that the fairy auto targets is brilliant, outside of using Fey Union, the fairy might chip heal some damage on a DPS that really sucks, something that you can easily resolve through Whispering Dawn or the like. And I kind of also view it as when I'm tired from like a long day at work and log into the game, I'm questioning, like, will I have the energy to keep up with cardio weaving for 6 hours after work for a 6-hour long gaming session? In my mind, it's unlikely for longer than 4 hours, in which case EOS taking the reins can be a huge help. Third con is BROIL spam is boring. Like, yes, it's a pro because it is very hard to mess up and you're getting a lot of value from it. Very consistent. You will be very consistent. But outside of harder raid content, it is a slog. Low level dungeons is just Art of War spam over and over again. It's not interesting, it's powerful. It's very powerful. Like, I cannot emphasize that enough, guys. You will absolutely dumpster whatever content you're doing just by doing that, but it's hideously boring. The fourth con is that because the Scholar has the raid buff chain stratagem, it's very possible for your group to represent it poorly. Misaligned raid buff windows, them not using cooldowns or big abilities during it, it's very possible to make chain stratagem look really useless if you cherry pick data from FF logs. So now the fifth con is that the Scholar can very easily run out of gas if misplayed, easier than any other healer, including the Sage. And this is a situation where you spent all of your cooldowns, you don't have any of them up at a given moment, and this includes obviously when you're out of Aetherflow, meaning no Aetherflow abilities are up. So that means there's no Recitation for Recitation Indom, no Aetherflow for basic Indom, no Sacred Soil, no Whispering Dawn. Whispering Dawn's on cooldown, Big Fairy SERAPH is on cooldown. This is a state that is very possible on Scholar, and it genuinely sucks. I say the Scholar has this worse than even the Sage because the Sage gets their Aetherflow equivalent called Serpent Skull every 20 seconds, whereas the Scholar, you can in theory blow all 3 Aetherflow stacks at the start of when you get Aetherflow up, and now you have 50 seconds of no Aetherflow, which as you can well imagine sucks because the equivalent is that the Sage gets their next Aetherflow equivalent, their Serpent Skull, at 20-second intervals and will never be in a 50 or 55 second wait time for it. The Scholar, however, is put in that. And I mean, yes, ultimately when all the numbers are said and done, the Scholar gets the same amount over the same period every 60 seconds. But I have said, and I will always say, I'd rather get the slow trickle of them in at 20-second intervals than wait for all 3 to 60 seconds in. Like, the payout at the end of the day is the same, but the way that you're getting it is much different. Which really brings us to our final section, which is the final takeaways that I have for the Scholar. Really, in summary for the Scholar, what we have here is an extremely consistent healer, more so than any other healer in this game. Between the Fairy, the clean DPS contribution rotation, the option to use Ruin 2, the movement speed buff, and the extremely available big bulky shields, the Scholar is a healer that I personally do call the most consistent healer in Final Fantasy XIV going into Endwalker. Like, there is a metric ton of power behind its kit, and I think that It's something that a lot of people who don't raid or haven't healed much don't see at first, and it is truly going to be able to do some wild, crazy things leveraging its entire kit from top to bottom. It's going to really smooth out all of the hard, rough edges of progression. Like literally the movement speed buff expedient on its own, and 1/3 of the fight's duration having some sort of speed boost, whether it's expedient or your own sprint, is in and of itself absolutely insane. Like utterly insane. And especially with a pre-planned static that knows when expedient's being used or times it at a particular mechanic, you literally do not have anything in this game that gets quite to the same level as taking the edge off of raid mechanic than that, because it's most of the hard raid mechanics, like say E12S Lions that I know a lot of people hit for walls, or electric cycles for instance in E11S. These are essentially movement based mechanics. You're getting a way to enhance movement for movement based mechanics. It doesn't get much more literal than this, guys. It really does not. But, and this is a very huge Nicki Minaj Cardi B sized but, this comes at the extreme cost of the Scholar needing to know their kit. You need to, as the player, know what kind of thing you're piloting. Being able to understand the major trade-offs of a skill like Dissipation, or the fact that they cannot manually control their fairy outside of Fey Union Fairy Tether, or of knowing to let their regens and fairy do work, and the balancing act of regens versus stronger bursts of healing. Not everything needs an Indom, guys. Or of knowing the major trade-offs of minor potency improvements through energy drain weaving versus spending that on Aetherflow for a more powerful healing option to give themselves more room, which one's going to be a DPS increase with your particular group. I will always say this is Aetherflow is a very you to your comfort kind of thing. But one Scholar may do in a group that knows what they're doing and doesn't make mistakes with energy drain spam is probably on the same Scholar going to be radically different if you put them in a group that doesn't know what they're doing. Final message that I have to say to everyone is when played properly, the Scholar is going to be the absolute monster in the room during Endwalker. It's going to be no different than it has been this entire time. The perks are undeniable and very strong, and I personally can tell you I greatly look forward to keeping Scholar in my toolbox. It is absolutely not going anywhere. I see it being definitely very, very powerful, and people are going to be like, oh, that's Scholar Copium. Have you seen Expedient or done Savage Raids? This is going to be nutty. Just Expedient alone, but the consistency, like, is big.